Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the supreme being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth, and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Announcements by the President.
Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from the Speaker of the House of Representatives. March 12, 2018, Dear President of the Senate, Establishment of Joint Select Committee. At a sitting held on Friday, March 9, 2018, the House of Representatives agreed to the following. 1. Resolved that in accordance with Standing Order 64-1C, the Constitution Amendment Tobago Self-Government Bill 2018 be referred to a Joint Select Committee to be established for its consideration and report by July 31st, 2018. 2. Resolved that subject to the concurrence of the Senate on the establishment of the Joint Select Committee on the Constitution Amendment Tobago Self-Government Bill 2018, the following 6 members be appointed to serve with an equal number from the Senate on the Joint Select Committee to consider and report on the Constitution Amendment Tobago Self-Government Bill 2018. Mrs. Camille Robinson-Regis, MP, Mr. Fitzgerald Hines, MP, Ms. Shamfa Kajo, MP, Mr. Terence Dialsingh, MP, Ms. Ramona Ramdial, MP, Ms. Rudranath Indar Singh, MP. I respectfully request that the Senate be informed of these decisions at the earliest convenience, please. Respectfully, Bridget Mary Anisette George, Speaker.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives.
Attorney General.
Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 1121, I beg to move for the suspension of Standing Order 76 in relation to the Anti-Gang Bill 2018.
Honourable Senators, the question is that in accordance with Standing Order 1121, Standing Order 76 be suspended in relation to the Anti-Gang Bill 2018. Those in favour say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The clerk will now read the short title of the bill.
On the supplemental order paper, the Anti-Gang Bill 2018, in the name of the Attorney General. Papers.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honour to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the supplemental order paper in the name of the Minister of Finance. The second reports of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Sugar Industry Labour Welfare Committee for the years ended September 30, 1999, 2000, 2001, and 2002. The audited financial statements of the Sports Company of Trinidad and Tobago for the financial year ended September 30, 2017, and the annual report of the Trinidad and Tobago Securities Exchange Commission for the year ended September 30, 2017. Thank you, Madam President.
Minister of Rural Development and Local Government.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honour to lay on the table the following papers as listed in the order paper in my name. The annual administrative reports of the Port of Spain City Corporation for the period October 2014 to September 2015, and October 2015 to September 2016. Thank you very much.
Minister of Trade and Industry.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honour to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in my name. The annual administrative reports of the Business Development Company Limited for the fiscal years 2009-2010, 2010-2011, and 2011-2012. The annual administrative report of Invest TT Limited for the year 2014. The annual administrative report of Export TT Limited for the fiscal year 2014-2015. Thank you, Madam President.
Government Business.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honour to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper and the supplemental order paper in the names of the Minister in the Office of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Sport and Youth Affairs. The Children's Community Residence Children's Home Regulations 2018, the Children's Community Residences Rehabilitation Centres Regulation 2018, and the National Policy on Sport 2017 to 2027.
Reports from committees.
Minister of Rural Development and Local Government.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honour to present the following report as listed on the order paper in my name. The sixth report of the Joint Select Committee on Human Rights, Equality and Diversity. Third session 2017 to 2018. 11th Parliament on an inquiry into the impact of the mental health and family life of remandees at the remand prisoners. Thank you.
Senator Hussain.
Madam President, I have the honour to present the following report as listed on the order paper in my name. The seventh report of the Joint Select Committee on Human Rights, Equality and Diversity, third session, 27-2018, 11th Parliament on an inquiry into the status of the implementation of the recommendations of the 2015 report of the Joint Select Committee on Human Rights, Diversity and the Environment, and Sustainable Development on the examination of programs and services which provide support to victims of domestic violence. Thank you.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I have the honor to present the following report as listed on the supplemental order paper in my name. The 10th report of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, third session, 2017-2018, 11th Parliament, on an examination into the inventory control and internal audit systems within the public service, with specific reference to follow up to the third and fourth reports of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee.
Urgent questions.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Honorable Minister of Works and Transport. In light of the suspension of the passenger ferry service between Trinidad and Tobago, can the Minister indicate what immediate measures are being taken to address this problem?
Minister of Works and Transport, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, in the interests of public safety, the Port Authority of Trinidad and Tobago has decided to temporarily suspend the operations of the passenger ferry until all outstanding work is completed. The TNT Express has been the lone passenger vessel in service and has been making the crossing in approximately 4 hours and is overdue for its statutory maintenance program. The TNT Spirit was expected to resume the service on March 13th. However, there are still some outstanding work to be addressed and is now expected to resume operations on or before March 22nd, 2018. At this time, persons who wish to travel from March 23rd and onward can purchase their ferry tickets at the terminal, or at the remote agents or online. During the period March 13th to 22nd, only tickets for the Cabo Star can be purchased. The authority is committed to providing this essential service and will accommodate all passengers on flights from Caribbean Airlines at no extra cost to the passenger. The vehicles of passengers with confirmed tickets will be accommodated on the daily sailing of the Cabo Star, and all ticket holders with vehicles will be shuttled via PTSC to the Piaco International Airport and the ANR International Airport, accordingly at no additional cost. Persons without vehicles may go directly to Caribbean Airlines, where they will be accommodated for the specific date of travel as is listed on the confirmed ferry ticket. I thank you.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate whether what percentage of the traveling public would be impacted upon by this situation that has occurred involving the withdrawal of the TNT Spirit from service, given the amount of passengers that would use that service on a daily basis? Could you
Minister
share
of
with
Works
us?
and Transport.
Madam President, all passengers with confirmed tickets will be accommodated on the air bridge. I repeat, all passengers with confirmed tickets will be accommodated.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate whether CAL will be putting on additional flights to accommodate the extra passenger load given this situation that we are faced with?
Minister of Works and Transport.
Thank you again, Madam President. Madam President, my information is that CAL will be putting on extra flights and will also be bringing in additional airlines to accommodate all passengers who want to travel to Tobago.
Next question, Senator Mark.
To the Honourable Minister of Trade and Industry. Given reports of an imminent shutdown of Tobago businesses due to the problems on the sea bridge, can the Minister inform the Senate of the measures being implemented to avert this problem?
Minister of Trade and Industry, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Let me say that the government understands the concerns of the business community of Tobago and certainly the effect of the current matter of the ferries on the economy of Tobago. But really, there's no need for a shutdown. But even though we admit that the situation is one that is critical, the genesis is the ferry matter, and that we accept. And government has found solutions to the ferry matter, one being that the Minister of Works and Transport has spoken to these solutions, one being the purchase of the Galleon's Passage, whose arrival we expect pretty soon. The point is, there's no need for a shutdown. What will a shutdown do? It will only further have a negative effect on the economy. But the point is, this government remains committed to finding solutions. And again, what is necessary is constant engagement and collaboration. There's been engagement and collaboration at the level of the Prime Minister. And only this morning, the Tobago House of Assembly met, this is the division of the economy and finance, met this morning with the chamber, with the business chamber in Tobago. There were some frank and fruitful discussions. I know that there's a communique which I do not want to speak to, but I know that there is a communique which will be released to the public this afternoon. And let's wait to hear what are some of the outcomes of the discussions held this morning.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate what measures her government intends to take in the event of a shutdown by businesses in Tobago? Because that is a direct question that is posed. So we want to know what measures are being taken, Madam President.
Minister of Trade and Industry.
Yeah, let me say to the goodly Senator that there's unlikely to be any shutdown because there has been engagement, as I said, as early as today on the whole question of the issues surrounding the business persons and the impact of the ferry issue on the economy. I do not want to preempt the results and the outcomes and the outcome of those discussions this morning. But what I can say to you that there will be a communique issued this afternoon, and you can listen in. I doubt very much there's going to be any question of shutdown in Tobago for those 2 days.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, without revealing too much, could the Honourable Minister indicate what was this engagement about and who the parties involved in this engagement from the business side and from the Tobago House, the House of Assembly Tobago?
Minister of Trade and Industry.
Thank you very much. Mr. Joel Jack, the Assemblyman with responsibility for finance and economy, would have been in that meeting. And I believe that then all of the members of the Tobago business community would have been there. My understanding is that there were deep and lengthy discussions on the solution to the ferry issue, yes, but it went further to how we can move to help restore business in Tobago. So that the discussions were open and frank, but at this point, what we call for is more collaboration and engagement so that we find solutions to the issues at hand. And let me give you my commitment, even as Minister of Trade and Industry in Trinidad and Tobago, I liaise constantly with Mr. Joel Jack, who is the Administrative Secretary, the Assemblyman with responsibility for these issues. And again, I think everyone is determined to resolve the issues, to move on, and to strengthen the Tobago economy.
Questions on notice. Questions for oral answer.
Madam President, the government has announced that it will be answering all 3 questions listed on the order paper.
Senator Ma.
Thank you, Madam President. Question number 56 to the Honourable Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Minister of Energy and Energy Industries.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the Board of Directors of Petrotrin has been given a mandate to return the company to profitability and its management as a private, commercially oriented company. In this exercise, the Board of Petrotrin is in consultation with stakeholders with a view to securing a sustainable turnaround of the company to return Petrotrin to viability. The board has also built on the work presented by the team appointed by government to review the operations of Petrotrin and to make recommendations for its restructuring, better known as the Lashley Report, which was submitted on 2017, June the 1st. These discussions are ongoing with frequent updates to the government and all stakeholders. At this time, the board is examining a number of strategic alternatives and has not selected privatization or any other of those options, but will make that selection in consultation with all relevant stakeholders. Given the complexity of the matter, no definite timeline has been set for the completion of this exercise. However, given the serious financial position of the company, an early report by the board is expected. I thank you.
President, could the Honourable Minister indicate to us what are some of these strategic alternatives that the board is currently considering?
Minister?
Well, just to whet your appetite, obviously, one of the recommendations is to split the company into business units, one for refining and marketing, one for exploration and production. There's also another view from stakeholders that exploration and production be further subdivided into exploration and production land and marine, which includes almost solely Trinidad operations. There's also a view articulated by the union that you have a human resource division, and they are even saying you put the Augustus Long Hospital as a separate business unit. Petrotrin has long tentacles in the community of Pointe-à-Pierre and Marabella. It has extremely long tentacles in the communities of the southwestern peninsula, from Faizabad straight down to Seagrass. So the decisions that is ultimately made obviously will have to be in the best interest of the stakeholders, and in particular the shareholders, which are the people of Trinidad and Tobago. But we are taking serious cognizance of the impact, what decisions will be taken on the lives of the community that impact directly on Petrotrin's operation.
Senator Mark?
President, in light of the gravity of the financial situation facing Petrotrin, can the minister indicate whether the board has been given a timeline within which to report and to implement your final recommendations?
Minister?
We have given no specific timeline, but to save and accept, there has been the beginning of a restructuring exercise where a transition team has been set up with various members of the board accepting positions of executive directors and the engagement of other third-party officials in the search for a new management team. That mandate has been given a maximum period of 6 months. So I think in 6 months' time, there should be great clarity as to the future of Petrotrin and what the options are.
Senator Mark?
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate whether there is space, emergent space for agreement between the OWTU and the management and board of Petrotrin in narrowing the gap as it relates to the areas of divisions that ultimately will arise given the restructuring of Petrotrin? Is there room for, some kind of compromise?
Minister?
Obviously, there's room for that, Madam President, and I want to say that the future of Petrotrin will not have a smooth ride unless we have the engagement of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union. We are conscious of that, and we are working assiduously to bring that to fruition.
Next question, Senator Mark?
Thank you, Madam President. Question number 57 to the Honourable Minister of Works and Transport.
Minister of Finance?
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. On behalf of the government and the Minister of Works and Transport, I will answer this question. The answer to the first part, the procurement method used to acquire the vessel was as follows. A cabinet-appointed subcommittee initiated the process for securing a suitable vessel, initially for lease, for servicing the sea bridge by conducting a market survey. This was done by making contact with internationally reputable ship brokers, ship managers, ship charterers, and ship owners, and requesting assistance from the governments of Australia, Canada, Italy, and Japan through their diplomatic representatives in Trinidad and Tobago. Arising from this market survey, a company by the name of Sealease Limited advised that a vessel meeting the specific requirements of the government had been previously constructed for a client in Venezuela who could not complete the sale. An offer for sale was thereupon made to the government. The subcommittee reviewed this offer and conducted all necessary due diligence. Both foreign and local experts visited and inspected the vessel and concluded that it was suitable. NIDCO was apprised of the process and satisfied itself with the due diligence conducted. NIDCO also agreed with the view that the vessel was suitable for use on the sea bridge. They then proceeded to purchase the vessel. As a result of this, a memorandum of agreement was then prepared and executed between NIDCO and the seller of the vessel on the 12th of January 2018. With respect to the second part of the question, the Cabinet Subcommittee's original mandate was to acquire a vessel for the sea bridge by entering into what is known as a time charter arrangement, a lease arrangement. This arrangement would have cost upwards of US $8 million per year. In fact, the estimate I have is US $8.2 million per year. During the process I have just described, the market survey, an offer was made for the purchase of a new build vessel meeting the government specifications for the sum of $17.38 million. When one compares this to the time charter arrangement, one will see that in just 2 years, the sum of $17 million would have been expended under the lease arrangements without owning the asset. Consequently, the obvious decision was made to purchase the vessel. With respect to the third part of the question, the terms and conditions of the purchase were a deposit of 10% of purchase price, delivery of the vessel at Nansha, Guangzhou, Guangdong in the People's Republic of China, delivery of the vessel 3 days after notice of readiness, modification and upgrade works to be completed by the seller, vessel to be delivered with everything on board and onshore, including spare parts and spare equipment. The cancellation date, if the seller defaulted, was March the 10th, 2018. On delivery of the vessel, the deposit to be released to the seller and the balance of the purchase price, less a retention of 5%, equaling US $850,000. The retention of $850,000 US to be released to the seller in 2 equal parts. $425,000 upon completion of the installation of the canopies and other seller obligations at the shipyard in Cuba, the place of closing and the balance on delivery of spare parts for the vessel, including bearings, seals, and shafts. The place of closing of the transaction was Hong Kong. The seller warranted that the vessel was free from encumbrances and disputes arising out of the purchase to be referred to arbitration in London.
Madam President, would the Minister be willing to make available to the Parliament a copy of the Memorandum of Agreement entered into between NIDCO and the seller of the vessel?
Minister of Finance.
I'll be guided by the Cabinet on that. I will seek Cabinet's approval and revert.
Senator Mark.
Could the Honourable Minister indicate whether he can share with us the original price that the owner of that vessel had intended to pay for it prior to the government purchasing that vessel for $17.38 million US?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. I do not have that precise information. However, I can inform this Honorable Senate that the government is in possession of 2 international valuations for the vessel, the lower of which is $19 million.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, can the Honourable Minister make available to this Parliament copies of the 2 international valuations for the purchase of the vessel that you have just outlined
Minister
for the
of Finance.
purposes of this Parliament?
Madam President, I will seek Cabinet approval and revert.
Senator Mark.
Could I ask through you, Madam President, how soon would the Minister be able to seek Cabinet's approval and then report to this Honourable Senate, Madam President?
Minister of Finance.
As soon as possible.
And
Next.
could you...
No, Senator Mark. Your 4 questions.
Oh, sorry, Madam.
Next question, Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam. Question number 58 to the Honourable Minister of Works and Transport.
Minister of Works and Transport.
Madam Speaker, again on behalf of the government and on behalf of the Minister of Works and Transport, I am pleased to answer this question. We are a team. Madam President, the purchase cost of the vessel is US $17.38 million. Other costs associated with the vessel are as follows. The sailing of the vessel by an international ship manager from China to Trinidad and Tobago, US $811,800. Legal fees associated with the purchase, US $25,000. Clearly not in Senator Ramdeen's class. Inspection of the vessel, $27,165. Valuation survey report, US $25,000. There are also some additional costs as follows. Sealing of space between the ramp door and the hull of the vessel, installing a canopy on the vehicle deck to protect against sea spray in stormy conditions, installing additional anchor rings for securing vehicles on the vehicle deck, installing full canopies over the sun deck, installing and outfitting additional male and female washroom facilities on the sun deck, installing a cafe and bar facilities on the starboard and port side of the sun deck, remodeling the men's washroom, installing fixing rails for new seating on the passenger deck, and replacement of existing seating with Berthaud passenger contoured seats. These costs are estimated at US $350,000.
Senator Mark.
Could the Honourable Minister indicate to us what is the overall cost of bringing the vessel to Port of Spain? And could he tell us...
No, one question at a time, Senator Mark.
The cost of...
Yes. Minister of Finance.
The final cost.
Madam Speaker, if one does... Sorry, Madam President, I apologize. If one does simple arithmetic, the purchase cost is 17.38. The costs associated with the purchase and getting the vessel here are approximately $900,000 US. The costs of the upgrades that are for the account of the government, because a number of items are for the account of the seller, is $350,000. So that is $1.25 million plus $17.38 million, approximately $17.63 million US.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate, as far as he's aware, this would be the final cost to the taxpayers of this country insofar as that vessel is concerned?
Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, the only variable in this entire list of costs will be the consumption of fuel, because the consumption of fuel is always an estimate. I can tell you, however, Madam President, is that the vessel has proven to be very fuel efficient and is using less fuel than anticipated.
Could the Honourable Minister, Madam President?
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Could the Honourable Minister indicate to us when will this galleon's passage vessel finally dock in Port of Spain?
Minister of Finance.
Certainly, Madam President. The vessel is now safely berthed alongside in the port of Yokohama, Japan, which is the second largest city in Japan, by the way. It is loading additional fuel tanks, stores, and provisions for its trans-Pacific journey from Yokohama to Honolulu. It is scheduled to take on bunkering for the non-technical among us, that means fuel, on Thursday, and it is scheduled to depart Yokohama on Thursday, and barring inclement weather and other unforeseen conditions, the vessel is scheduled to arrive in Port of Spain at the end of April 2018. I wish to repeat, contrary to the fake news of the UNC, the vessel is safely in Japan and in perfect condition.
Senator Mark.
What is the provisional estimated fuel cost, Madam President, for the entire journey? Because he said that is one of the factors that we cannot anticipate. So could he provide this Honorable House with an estimated cost of the fuel charges that will have to be incurred by the taxpayers of this country, given the arrival of this vessel at the end of April?
Minister of Finance.
If I had known that Senator Mark would want to know how many liters of diesel the vessel is projected to consume between the port of Nansha in China and the port of Spain in Trinidad and Tobago, I would have brought that information with me. But I don't need cabinet approval to provide that to the Honourable Senator. I will do so as soon as I return to the Ministry of Finance. I will send the information because I just happen to have it.
Requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on definite matters of urgent public importance.
Senator Ubika.
Thank you, Madam President. I hereby seek your leave to move the adjournment of the Senate today under Standing Order 16 to discuss an urgent matter of definite importance, namely the failure of the government to effectively manage the Trinidad to Tobago Sea Bridge in light of the recent announcement that there will be no travel on the passenger ferries to Tobago for at least 10 days due to mechanical and safety issues. The matter is definite because it deals specifically with the failure of government to effectively manage the Trinidad to Tobago Sea Bridge, given the recent announcement withdrawing the TNT Express from service due to safety concerns and the fact that the TNT Spirit has been on dry dock since June last year. The matter is urgent because the unreliable service has negatively impacted the tourism industry in Tobago and will affect bookings for the upcoming Easter holiday. The government's inability to administer and maintain a reliable sea bridge service to Tobago has put a severe strain on the economy of Tobago and caused a number of businesses to shut down. The matter is of public importance because the collapse of the sea bridge has led to the collapse of the Tobago economy, resulting in ever-increasing hardships for the people of Tobago, including limited access to basic commodities. This latest development in the sea bridge saga would further cripple the Tobago economy and all but destroy the island's tourism sector.
Honourable Senators, I have considered the motion of the Senator, and I am satisfied that this matter qualifies to be raised as a matter of urgent public importance. This matter also requires the leave of the Senate. Is the Senate prepared to grant such leave? Honourable Senators, the request having been supported, This motion will stand over until 6 p.m. in accordance with Standing Order 16.5.
Motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate and moved by a minister.
Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, having regard to the correspondence from the Speaker of the House in relation to the establishment of a joint select committee to consider and report by the 31st of July 2018 on the Constitution Amendment Tobago Self-Government Bill 2018, I beg to move that the Senate concur with the House of Representatives in the establishment of the committee and that the following 6 senators be appointed to serve. 1, Mr. Clarence Rambarat. 2, Mr. Nigel De Freitas. 3, Mr. Foster Cummings. 4, Mr. Saddam Hussein. 5, Dr. Daneshwar Mahabir. And 6, Mr. Stephen Creese.
Honorable Senators, the question is that the Senate concur with the House of Representatives in the establishment of a joint select committee to consider and report by July the 31st, 2018 on the Constitution Amendment Tobago Self-Government Bill 2018 and that the following 6 senators be appointed to serve. Mr. Clarence Rambarat, Mr. Nigel De Freitas, Mr. Foster Cummings, Mr. Saddam Hussein, Mr. Daneshwar Mahabir, Mr. Stephen Creese. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it.
Public business, government business, bills second reading.
Honorable Senators, the debate on the second reading of the following bill, which was in progress when the Senate adjourned on Tuesday, February 27th, 2018, will be resumed. A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago Act, the Customs Act, and the Exchange Control Act. There have been some 19 speakers on this bill to date, including the mover of the motion. Senator Ramdeen.
Good afternoon, Madam President, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute on this bill, an act to amend the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago Act, the Customs Act, and the Exchange Control Act. I hope, Madam President, in my contribution this afternoon to go through the very important provisions that this bill seeks to amend and which we are asked as a Senate to approve, and to present to the Honorable Attorney General, the mover, or the presenter of this piece of legislation, certain amendments that we wish to propose on this side that we consider will strengthen the legislation and will better serve the interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Before I get into the meat of this matter, the actual provisions, Madam President, what stands out in this piece of legislation when the Attorney General presented it was that we are asked to amend a number of pieces of legislation, and the Attorney General, in piloting this piece of legislation, indicated to the Honorable Senate that the reason why we are being asked to amend these pieces of legislation is because there are certain international obligations that we as a country are required to comply with. And also, certain committees and certain discussions that the government has had with various stakeholders has come up with these proposals that the Attorney General has indicated to the Senate is part of the government's whole of government approach, to use the words of the Attorney General, with respect to the fight against crime. In this particular case, 5 pieces of legislation are pointed out. Now, Madam President, we on this side, in the opposition, have demonstrated time and time again that we will support good legislation
and legislation that strikes the right balance between the citizen and the state. And when the Attorney General presents this type of legislation that calls for these wholesome amendments to different pieces of legislation, and what I wish to say is to cast absolutely no aspersions on my friend, the Honorable Attorney General, is that the difficulty that the government faces in presenting this type of legislation is a simple one. It is an issue of trust. The people of this country have lost trust in this government. And therefore, when the government, it may be well-intentioned that they bring these pieces of legislation to amend these different pieces of legislation. The difficulty that they have is to convince the population that what they are doing is acting in the best interest of the population. Because the mandate that was given to this administration 30 months ago has been whittled away over the last 30 months. And today, this administration suffers from a crisis of trust and confidence from the people of this country. And that is why when legislation like this is brought, and the Attorney General tells us that certain aspects of the legislation comes out of consultations with the National Anti-Money Laundering Committee, the NAMLAC committee, that comprises certain people. And then what we are told is that this is the outcome of those discussions. It provides us with a certain degree of difficulty in supporting that legislation without being provided with the information. Because time and time again, we've been told with respect to the FATCA legislation that we passed, that we supported, and that we, at the end of the day, had a good end product. We were told with the SSA legislation, certain things, which did not come to bear. And that is why we have a difficulty with this. So I would like, before getting into the actual provisions, to raise one more concern about this piece of legislation. And it is this, Madam President. We have been told that the reason why we must pass this legislation and these provisions is because we will be blacklisted, whether it be FATF or CFATF, or whether it be Global Forum, as the Attorney General said, that will come to the Parliament soon. One of the difficulties that I have, Madam President, is this. It seems as though the legislative agenda of Trinidad and Tobago is really being set by people outside of Trinidad and Tobago. And whereas we, as a country, should determine what are the laws that we, as a people, should enact in the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, with the SSA legislation and with this piece of legislation and the legislation to come without breaching the anticipation rule. It seems as though all we are doing is following the lead of other countries. And one has to think, Madam President, I think as a country, in the 56 years of independence that we have enjoyed, I think we can do better than that. I think as a country, Madam President, we are good enough as a people to path our own course and to decide what is in the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. We don't need CFATF and FATF to tell us why. And I'll tell you why, Madam President. This is a surprise on that side, because they are not accustomed to that. But today, in 2018, we have an international criminal court that governs the jurisdiction of countries around the world. And you know where the idea of that came from? It was germinated right here in Trinidad and Tobago, right here. Because we produce people in this country who are able to chart our future. We don't need other people to tell us what is in the best interest to counter money laundering and the proceeds of crime and white-collar crime. And while it is commendable that as a country, as a developing country, there are certain international obligations that we must comply with, otherwise there would be serious consequences, I think we can do better than what we are being presented with. But that boils down to a very simple matter, Madam President. It simply boils down to the fact that you have an administration that is governing this country that we have said over and over again. They have no plan, they have no vision, and they have demonstrated that over the past 30 months. So, Madam President, I want to say at the outset that while the motive for bringing this piece of legislation may be a good one. The results to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, as we speak now, if this legislation is passed, is going to be very little in terms of providing any safety and security for them, which is the #1 priority and the cry of the people of this country right now, which this government has failed to deliver over the past 30 months. Now, I want to start off by replying to one or two things that the Attorney General highlighted in presenting this piece of legislation. And at the very end of the Attorney General's contribution, the Attorney General said that one of the best ways to treat with is to understand that this comes in a whole of government legislative approach. And what I'm reading from, Madam President, I apologize, is the Hansard of the Attorney General's contribution in piloting this bill, which was on the 20th of February 2018. Where we have analyzed the backlog on provisions, where we are improving the criminal administration system, the justice system, where we are delivering more capacity as we march to the end of February, and beginning of March, we will be opening a family and children's division of the court. For the first time, this country will see the opening of courts in Trinidad and Tobago. 19 pieces of law amended, all regulations done, 13,000 people interviewed, 2 court buildings procured out, because it is related to the criminal justice system. If you start to hive off and make systems work better, if you take 100,000 cases from the motor vehicle and road traffic arena and hive those out, if you impose new rules of court and you start to make that work, we are headed to a whole of government perspective solution, towards a solution, Madam President. Those were the words of the Honorable Attorney General. And I don't think, Madam President, as I've said before, that there's anyone who sits in this Senate that doesn't want to see the improvement in the criminal justice system. But one has to ask the question, is what we are asked to do here today, and this whole of government approach that the government has seemed to embark on, is that really going to fix the criminal justice system as we experience it on a day-to-day basis? The Attorney General made the point that over the last week, you would have seen, Madam President, that we've opened 2 courts in this country, 2 family and children division courts. Great. How is that going to help the people of Trinidad and Tobago? Well, let me tell you, I'll tell you why I'm serious. Madam President, for those who do not know about the court system, I will tell you about the court system because I know about it.
Senator Ramdeen, in telling us about the court system, I want you to relate what you are saying to the bill that is before us, okay?
Yes, ma'am.
I want you to relate it specifically to the bill. In my opening remarks, you will notice that I've said 19 persons have spoken on this bill. So I want you to be focused and also not go over what other presenters on this bill have already said, okay?
As you please, Madam President, I'm guided. Madam President, by clause 3 of this bill, the government is asking us to amend the Proceeds of Crime Act, and they are proposing that we amend the Proceeds of Crime Act to make money laundering a summary offense with a particular provision. Well, Madam President, the position in this country is this. The government proposes to add to what the summary courts, that is the magistrate courts as we understand it, to the workload of the magistrate court by adding more summary offenses to the books, the law books of this country. So, in the 4 corners of clause 3, with respect to that recommendation, let me say this, which I hope I will comply with Madam President's ruling, is this. The summary courts in this country, in San Fernando, let us start with, you have a shift system operating there. So you have one set of courts working in the morning and one set of courts working in the afternoon. They've closed down certain courts that used to be the old magistrate court, and they've transferred some of those to the High Court. And one has to wonder, this NAMLAC committee that has recommended this that's made this recommendation, that has found itself in legislation, I don't know what this NAMLAC committee had considered, which is the first point that I flagged. Because I can't understand how any right-thinking person sitting on a committee that is discussing improvements to the criminal justice system can ever propose adding to the criminal justice system in the summary courts without actually fixing the problems that we have there now. The mode of ventilation in the San Fernando Old Magistrate Court is today in 2018 LASCO. That is what a magistrate is asked to work under the conditions in San Fernando. LASCO, not peak, LASCO. And we don't find it. We don't find that it's important. The government doesn't find it important to improve on that system, to fix that before we decide to move forward and add to it. So, this proposal at Clause 3 to make money laundering a summary offense punishable by $25 million and 15 years imprisonment is going to be administered by a magistrate who is sitting in a court with a LASCO fan and writing with a ballpoint pen because she has no cat reporting, and that must be then transferred in some form so that the magistrate will then determine that. I mean, are we really serious? Is the government really serious about the administration of justice and saying, this is what the Attorney General told us. We must be proud about the fact that we're opening new courts. That's fine. But the courts that we have now, that has to administer the system now, that has to administer all of these laws now, when we make money laundering an indictable offense, which it is now, but we increase it to 50 million and 30 years, well, the court that has to administer that is the High Court. So, as we stand now, and you see, Madam President, the difficulty I have with this is this, you know. The difficulty I have is this. A magistrate must sit in San Fernando with a LASCO fan. But in September of last year, this administration, and this is very important, this administration in September of last year appointed 8 masters to do exactly what the Attorney General quoted in the Hansard. 8 masters in September, where this government tells us we must get more from less, and we must look at how we spend. But from September of last year, we've been paying 8 masters over $50,000 a month. $50,000 a month. That's $400,000 a month since September to now. To do what? To do nothing, because it had no court. It had no court. You're paying masters $50,000 a month from September. And do you know what is disturbing about that, Madam President? What is disturbing about that is the same court that has to administer Clause 3 under the proceeds of crime. You have people working in the High Court. You know they can't get up to today? The gratuity. They can't get the traveling allowance. Up to today, people who wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and leave their children home to come and do public service for the people of Trinidad and Tobago can't get a jacket allowance. And we don't think it's good enough to fix that before we bring laws here for them to continue doing. That's just not good enough. That is just not good enough. How can you do that and tell us get more from less, and people suffering in the High Court, giving up their lives and working as an emergency GSO till 8 and 9 o'clock in the night? We have to get our priorities right. And if we get our priorities right, we could get it right. But this government has demonstrated in the last 30 months. That's why we're debating this today, you know. Because we were told in December of last year, right, that the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service and law enforcement, we weren't told they wanted the mutual assistance. We were told they wanted anti-gang. But we'll do that next week. Because it was important in December, but it wasn't important for 100 murders after that. Well, Madam President, let me continue along the provisions of the Act. The first thing I want to say about this piece of legislation is that without a doubt, when one studies this legislation very carefully, this is a piece of legislation that clearly, ex facie, infringes upon the rights that are guaranteed to a citizen under Section 4 and 5. And I will demonstrate as I go along, Madam President, why I say so and why this piece of legislation should have been brought with the requirement of a special majority. So, Madam President, at Clause 4, and Madam President, I say so, having proposed by the amendments that the opposition seeks to put forward with respect to this legislation, that we are asking that that is the way in which we should fix what is presented to us today. Now, in Clause 4, the government proposes to add certain powers to the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago. And what I wish to focus on, Madam President, is subclause E, which is to be found at page 4 of the legislation. And that, Madam President, requires court legislation. In order to secure compliance with the written laws listed under Section 18F, the FIU may require a person to provide to it any documents, information, or explanation on any information. Well, Madam President, clearly, if you are requiring people to provide private information to the FIU, it must be in breach of your right to privacy. It must be. 2B, you have a judicial intervention because under 2B, that requirement is guarded by a warrant. But notwithstanding, when you come to 2E, which is something that Senator Choate, Senior Counsel, mentioned to us and went through in her contribution. Well, Madam President, we've reached a point where legislation is being provided to the Parliament for approval and passage. And this clause says, nothing in this section shall be construed as requiring any person to give any information which may incriminate him. Well, respectfully, Madam President, whoever the drafters of this piece of legislation, who drafted this piece of legislation, are not very au courant with the Constitution, which is the supreme law. Because what is the necessity of putting into legislation a clause, the guarantee that Parliament is not, or the prohibition against Parliament passing legislation like that, is to be found in Section 4 and 5. So, if I can, Madam President, be allowed to just take you to Section 5, which says that without prejudice to subsection 1, this is Section 5.2 of the Constitution, but subject to this chapter and to Section 54, Parliament may not authorize a court, tribunal, commission, board, or other authority to compel a person to give evidence against, unless he is afforded protection against self-incrimination and where necessary to ensure such protection. So how Section 2E finds itself as being some kind of safeguard in the legislation, it's really odious because it's already provided under the Constitution. So I don't know why that is there. Now, Madam President, the gamut of powers that this piece of amending legislation seeks to give to the FIU seems to be on the basis that we want to strengthen the FIU. So, again, the same point that I was making with respect to the courts is the same point that I want to make with respect to the FIU. Under Clause 5, the legislation seeks to provide a number of powers that the government thinks now we should give to the FIU. But like with the courts, and the summary courts and the High Court, shouldn't we try to fix the FIU and give the FIU what it requires before we add to the burden of what they have to do? So, in the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago 2017 annual reports, at page 13, this is a report that is signed off by Ms. Francois, the director. At page 13, allow me, Madam President, to highlight some of what is said in this report about the FIU. Under challenges for the compliance and outreach, the director of the FIU is highlighting what are the staff challenges for the FIU. And while this is in 2017, we are bringing legislation to give them more power. So, let's see. Supervision strategies implemented in this reporting year, that is 2017, have borne fruit. The Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago observed an improvement in compliance and awareness by entities in the high-risk sectors. However, the FIU's supervision could be more effective if internal and external challenges are resolved, such as, 1, high staff turnover, voluntary and involuntary, lengthy recruitment processes, budgetary constraints affecting public awareness, sensitization, and training, restrictions on entry to premises, and limited sanction powers. Madam President, if the director of the FIU is telling us in the 2017 report, this is what needs to be done, these are the shortcomings of the FIU, this is what we need to do to improve it, shouldn't any right-thinking administration try to fix this first before we add to the powers that they have to administer? In Chapter 5, at page 57, under the heading Human Resources, the director tells us, the FIU seeks to create a culture of excellence and integrity that inspires exceptional teamwork and performance. The 4th MER recognized that sufficient training, sufficient staff with the experience and skills to carry out its statutory functions and responsibilities is critical to the effective operation of the FIU. By developing a cadre of skilled officers who are okra with current and emerging issues in AML, CFT, and FIU will be better positioned to deliver high-quality intelligent reports to support the operational needs of the LEAs and to supervise and monitor. And then, to deliver this priority, this is what the director tells us they need. Fill the vacant positions in the Compliance and Operations Division and renew its proposal to the relevant authorities to restructure and increase its staff complement. Provide training opportunities on the regulatory and analysis functions.
Senator Ramdeen, could you just, I think your point has been made, and I don't think that you need to go through in all that detail about the FIU report of 2017. You need to just, we're not dealing with the report per se. We've made your reference that I think you can move on or tie up the point that you want to make.
I'm obliged, Madam President. We save the best for last on this side. So, Madam President, we have, let me get to another provision that I have some difficulty with. In this legislation, by Clause 5, we are asked to amend Section 45 of the Customs Act. Well, Madam President, in accordance with what your ruling, can I just simply say, to wrap up the point I was making on the FIU, if we don't fix these systems, the legislation just simply will not work. We have to fix the institutions and equip them in order to be able for these pieces of legislation and these amendments to become effective. And I say no more on that. But Madam President, in Clause 5, we are asked by Subclause C to amend Section 45 of the Customs Act. And we are asked to substitute the following paragraph. Delete paragraph C and substitute firearms, ammunition, bulletproof vests, firearm accessories including lasers, lights, holsters, scopes, and tools for the purpose of maintaining a firearm, except with the written permission of the police. This really, under the principal piece of legislation, Madam President, falls under a provision in the Customs Act that prohibits the importation of certain items. Firearms and associated with firearms, this is what we are trying to do. We're trying to improve on subsection C, and we're trying to insert a new subsection A in relation that this prohibition does not apply to persons who have an FUL. Well, Madam President, we would be burying our heads deeply in the sand if we continue with this idea of giving the Commissioner of Police the power, this type of power. One, which is not concerned with this act, to grant an FUL, but more direct to this act, is to give permission for persons to bring in these items into the country. Madam President, it is a well-known fact. One of the most revenue-generating things in this country is the grant of an FUL. And the time has come for us to move away from that, because there are legitimate businessmen in this country who wait years for the grant of an FUL. And there are people who simply pay $20,000 and they get the grant of an FUL. And we must come here and sanction today that people who bring in people who want to bring in firearms, ammunition, bulletproof vests, and firearm accessories, including lasers, lights, and holsters, scopes, and tools for the purposes of maintaining a firearm, must get the permission of the Commissioner of Police. Well, I simply can't support that, Madam President, because this will simply do what? Generate more income in that field. We have to get serious about this. The time has come for us to disband this idea of the Commissioner of Police granting an FUL and set up an independent commissioner to do it. Set up an independent body that you can still have a firearms appeal board so that people can get a fair shot at getting a firearm. There are people in this country who really need a firearm to protect themselves and their family. And the way we are going, it might be, with the rate of murders that we have in this country, everybody might need a firearm to protect themselves. But it's only those who can pay that will end up getting it, which is what we are going to do today. I can't support this, Madam President. I simply can't. There are a number of amendments that I have proposed, which I hope the Honourable Attorney General will consider in relation to subsection D, that seeks to amend section 228 of the Customs Act. But what I would like to focus on, Madam President, in the probably few minutes that I have left, is that by virtue of this piece of legislation, we are giving a very draconian power to the Comptroller of Customs, whereby the Comptroller of Customs is being granted a discretion to withhold the goods of someone who has not appealed to the Tax Appeal Board and has not paid assessed duty. It is found at page 7, clause 5, B, Roman numeral 2, which seeks to insert a new 2B into the legislation. That is the Customs Act. And it does not form part of the amendments, Attorney General, that I have provided to the Senate for consideration. But I think we will be doing ourselves a disservice if we grant this discretion, which is a very wide discretion, to the Comptroller of Customs, but we don't circumscribe it in some way by seeking to set out some factors as a minimum threshold that the Comptroller of Customs ought to properly take into consideration. Just like the argument with respect to the Commissioner of Police, we have just suffered from institutional deterioration. And what has happened is that all of these public authorities, unfortunately, over time, have become corrupt. The administration is trying its best to put things in place to wipe out that corruption. And one of the ways in which passage of legislation can seek to wipe out that corruption is by inbuilt safeguards in the legislation that governs the exercise of a discretion. And in this particular case, where you are giving the Comptroller of Customs the power to refuse the goods that are imported by a particular consignee, while I understand the motive and the mischief that the government seeks to address by virtue of this piece of legislation, what I can say is that we will be better off if we put in some factors, perhaps that the Comptroller himself may suggest, but that will balance that power with some sense of fairness on the part of the person whose goods are sought to be confiscated or to be held pending appeal to the Tax Appeal Board, or released pursuant to this provision. How much time do I have left, Madam President, if may I ask?
You have until 2:52.
2:52, 7 minutes. Thank you, Madam President. So, in the amendments that we have also flagged, Madam President, we have sought to deal with the time periods over which the legislation seeks to place a duty upon persons who hold records under the Customs Act. And while the reality is that the Customs and Excise need to tighten the way in which they administer the Customs Act, it seems as though the improvements that are sought by the legislation under Section 228, subclause D of Section 5, seems, I think, to go a little bit too far, Madam President, in terms of reducing the time periods for which the documents are to be requested or to be held. And in those circumstances, we have made some suggestions that we on this side respectfully suggest would better strike a balance between the ability of the customs authorities to administer the provisions of the Act and to provide a certain degree of fairness to a consignee who has a duty to keep documents for a particular period of time. Madam President, one understands the difficulty that the government faces with respect to the issue of crime and criminality, and one understands the approach that the government has taken to seek to strengthen the institutions that are covered by this piece of legislation. And perhaps, Madam President, when one looks at the FIU report...
Ramdeen, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. When one looks at the FIU report, there is one thing the FIU and certain other institutions, the Integrity Commission, the Police Complaints Authority, there is one complaint that keeps arising over and over, both on the institutional side, on the administration side, and on the people side, which is this. We have had an Office of the Director of Public Prosecution in this country that has served us for 56 years, that is in charge of all criminal prosecutions. And when one looks at the FIU report, the thing that jumps out the most, Madam President, and the question that everyone asks, and the Honourable Minister of Agriculture dealt with it in his contribution as well, is how can you have a system where the FIU can detect almost $22 billion of money passing through the system that is the subject of suspicious transactions, and the number of prosecutions are so low? And I wonder, in preparing for this debate, whether the time has not come for us to not amend pieces of legislation piecemeal, but not as a country take a general approach to prosecution that is different from what we've experienced for the past 56 years, and recognize that the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution simply can't do it all in one office. Has the time come when we should give those prosecuting authority, or those institutions such as the FIU, the Police Complaints Authority, the Integrity Commission, the power to prosecute for the offenses that are created by these acts? And it's very relevant, because what we are doing in this legislation is creating further offenses. And the further offenses are going to be administered by the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. Files are going to be prepared. As Senator Small always says, white-collar crime doesn't exist in Trinidad and Tobago, because you've had investigations that are going on for over 10 years, and nobody has been charged. But the one thing that we are sure about is that the resources of the taxpayers is used to fund these investigations over and over. How, as a country, are we going to move forward when we fund the FIU, we pass legislation, we create offenses, summary and indictable, and at the end of the day, the actual end product that we all look forward to, which is the prosecution of people, is non-existent? So perhaps the time has come for the government, this administration is in power now, to consider whether we shouldn't have specialized offices to prosecute these different offenses that are created under these different pieces of legislation. And I suggest that and throw it out there for the Attorney General and the administration for the time that they are left in power to consider it. Because it is about time, Madam President, that we realize the system is just not working. and the passage of legislation over and over is not happening. So that is my short contribution to this bill this afternoon, Madam President. I hope to contribute and put forward and advance the arguments in the committee stage for the amendments that I hope will be passed on at some point in time and will be considered by the government in the fullness of time. And I hope that if we accept those recommendations as set out in the amendments that we suggest, we will be able to have a better piece of legislation that will serve the interest of Trinidad and Tobago and the people of Trinidad and Tobago. I thank you.
Senator Creese.
Thank you, Madam President. As I rise to speak on this omnibus piece of legislation, which is drawing our attention to 5 acts, I believe, the Mutual Assistance, the Proceeds of Crime Act, the FIU Act, the Customs Act, and the Exchange Control Act. What struck me off the bat was that perhaps there's another piece of legislation that should be amended, redrafted, or recreated to focus on a missing item. And to me, that would be the Representation of the People's Act, because I want to argue that overall, the whole question of campaign funds, campaign financing, or funds for campaign financing is critical in terms of the overall objectives of this act. In that regard, it is my contention that if we are to measure the potential success a year from now, 2 years from now, we have to ask ourselves, well, how would we be sure that what we did here today has achieved its objectives? We first then have to be clear on what are the objectives. And I want to hazard that safety and security, both of the individual and of the state, discouraging crime and criminality as a second plank of those objectives, the question of international collaboration, again with the whole question of peace and anti-crime activity, and of course, in our own particular case, as a young nation, the building and the strengthening of our democracy. And in that regard, the whole question of process becomes important. Other speakers have dealt with the need for consultation and the absence of that in that regard. So I wouldn't get into that. But I wanted to just make the point in connection with consultation that that is really part of the whole democratic process, and that it is secular, because there's consultation before any new act or amendment, and then there's this new bill as amended, and after that, down the road, there's the need for review, which is again a consultative process. So we ought to see it, if we see it as being circular, then we get a sense of how critical it is to do that. So I believe that there for now. But at the end of the day, on the broader objective of building democracy and how this legislation falls into that platform, it is critical then to understand the need to go that route and to ensure that, and this is important to small island states like ourselves, the advantage of being a small island state, and there are many disadvantages, but one of the advantages is that we can consult far more easily because you can gather the people in a few places, stadia or whatever, and have that direct influence. So that's one of the advantages that, we ought to exploit in our own case. Moving on from there, I think, again, from the background of whether this act is achieving the objectives that we agree on that it should go after, The other issue that we need to focus on is the whole question of how do we measure these objectives? How are we assured that we are getting to where we want to be? And that poses problems for us. It poses problems in the age of globalism, again, being a small state up against multinationals. I think it was our Prime Minister who recently mentioned the whole questions of negotiating with these multinationals and the implications of that. But globalism, with the spread of the technology and so on, coming our doorsteps, we need to be clear as to where we stand in all of this and whether the provisions in this act, as it seeks to amend other acts, how well does it grapple with the question of globalism and whether globalism won't, instead of being international sharing, becomes a question of the mighty being able to lord it over us. And when I get into the question of either cyber warfare or the drug lords and their role in all of this and how this impacts them, we begin to see the connectivity between all of these issues. And therefore, the need for the spread of amendments to go across more than just the 5 acts that are listed here. But I will come back to that later on. The other issue, and again, dealing with the question of whether the safety and security issues that these amendments should assure us all of, both individual and of the state, has to do with, particularly in the information age, with are we attending in this or in the core legislation dealing with IT, with the prospects of cyber warfare, and against the background of what the Americans went through with Russia in their recent elections and are likely to go through during this year, where they have midterm elections and so on going on. Are we catering in this legislation for that? Are we satisfied that our existing IT legislation can keep those kind of negative forces in check and ensure the safety and viability of our state, so that this is no longer the age, yes, a few of the monolithic types of states are still bombing each other and so on, but this is the age basically of cyber warfare. And therefore, are we satisfied that the proceeds of crime cannot travel through cyberspace and avoid all, your traditional customs officers and central banks and so on operating at that level? So, and I'm not satisfied that what has been brought before us represents a package that speaks to that aspect of the matter. Because this is the information age, and cyber warfare is the weapon of choice. The computer, the iPad, the cell phone is really the weapon of choice in this age. And again, on the question of security and prevention of crime and criminal activity, there is the question for a small state, and this whole issue of the size of our state will keep cropping up. How do we stand? How can we pit our resources against the drug lords? And whether we are satisfied that these amendments would keep us safe and secure and not descend into the pit of being a narco state. And everywhere we turn, that is happening. That when you look at the productivity levels of some countries, when you look at the stock of goods and services that they supply, when you look at the stock of goods and services that they import or that they clearly are enjoying, there's a huge discrepancy. And are we satisfied that this legislation would deal with that discrepancy between the dominant or obvious or official economy as opposed to the underground economy, which may really be what's driving the country. So the question comes up again, are we satisfied that what is before us wouldn't continue to allow for that other economic activity that is prevailing? When I was growing up, there was import trade through citrus, out of Venezuela, largely in whiskey, to some extent in stereo items when there was this negative list and so on. And, and the question is, to what extent is that activity and those type of activities still part of what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago? And as I always do, I refer to what the Western history book says about, our culture of grumbling and smuggling and grumbling, and whether what we have proposed here really effectively contains that. So that there's the question of cyber warfare, the question of whether we are treating with the right base legislations is one we have to answer, and the whole cultural question of cultural continuity, what we've been accustomed doing by way of smuggling and so on, would that continue? Are we sufficiently tightening up on the issues? Good. And then the question of focus. What I have found with our methods of policing as well as our approach to legislation, there tends to be an institutional bias. And the bias and the focus tends to be on containing what I call the Laventille posse. And the focus is on what's coming down the hill from Laventille, as opposed to what's going up the hill at Highland Park, at Glencoe. And I'm making this reference in terms of, just like with the gang legislation, there seems to be a suggestion, an institutional bias that says that crime and criminality comes down the hill from Laventille and no other place.
Senator Creese, I'm so sorry, but you've spent about just over 10 minutes giving your context, but I need for you to specify with the bill before you. I need for you to move from context to specific clauses in the bill, please.
Thank you, Madam President. The next thing which we should draw attention to and praise with regard to this was its focus on reciprocity. When we were doing the FATCA legislation, that issue had come up, and it is good to note, and that is one of the positives of this, in that it focuses on, in terms of the mutual amendments in mutual assistance, on ensuring that there's that sharing of information that would allow for both countries who may be involved in a particular piece of information sharing to get at those elements who may otherwise have eluded detection. So that on the positive side, I want to congratulate the AG with respect to the provisions in that regard. That's on the positive side. Good. But again, the question of how the legislation is going to ensure effective deterrence of criminal activity, I have a concern. And the concern I have in that regard relates to the issue of how quickly these matters would wend their way through the court. And there is a bottleneck at our courts. And I find that the issue with regard to summary trial does not resolve that, and perhaps adds to the problem of the backlog at the court, so that if we pass this legislation, giving the country the impression that we are bringing resolution to an obvious problem. I was alerted this morning to the fact that someone who received a ticket in November of 2017 and did not pay, it's a traffic ticket, and did not pay the fine and failed to turn up at the court on the day, they lost track of the ticket, and so they went thereafter, to find out what date it has the matter, or what has come of the matter. Found out that the matter was put off, adjourned to November 2018. So a simple traffic ticket could easily take a year in the court. And I find that disconcerting because the lawyers haven't appeared as yet. And with them go another round of negotiations and so on, and what's on whose list and who is available when and so on. Because clearly that person would have on that occasion to either plead guilty or work with a lawyer. So the point I'm making is that unless we treat with how efficient, how smooth our courtroom operations are, all of this can end up being so much verbiage, so much old talk, and really not much action to come as a consequence. And that is disturbing. The other issue related to the courtroom aspect of this is, of course, the whole question of the need for harmonization of the fee structures that are involved. Again, other speakers have gone into that in detail, so I just wish to record that at the committee stage, we need to focus on that. And it's not necessary at this stage to go into the details of that, but we need to focus on getting the fines right. I would also like to draw my colleagues' attention to the issue underlying the provision for the controller to virtually disbar a broker. And I'm wondering, when I read that, I was wondering whether that doesn't amount to what the lawyers call restraint of trade. And it would seem that we are placing in the controller's hands the ability, if we are saying that person is going to be banned from engaging in import-export activity, as opposed to simply being made to pay a fine or even go to jail if we think it's something for which somebody should go to jail. But to say that you can no longer carry out this activity, I don't know, something about that rings as almost unnatural, I don't want to say cruel and unusual punishment because that's taking it too far, but unnatural. I have a problem accepting that as being something that should be done. I could be wrong, or maybe I could be advised that that is done in other jurisdictions, but I find it hard to accept. And in that regard, I often wonder whether the question raised as to if we are to go down that road, whether a special majority is required if we are to place that kind of almost summary power in the controller's hands. On the good side, the whole question, and this has to do now with the Exchange Control Act, the whole question of what is referred to as bearer negotiable instruments. I think that is a plus. A lot may have escaped already, good, and probably is escaping now, good. So that is why I think delay, in that regard, would almost be criminal to participate in any kind of delay that would allow for that mechanism to begin operation. We have to recognize that this is a place where, if you want to know in the next budget if gas price is going to go up, just go by the gas station the night before. And the length of the lines, good, or the disappearance of whatever good the rumor is that the tax or what have you, the VAT or what have you is going to go up. Just go by the grocery and what is disappearing off the shelves. You could write, if you're a journalist, you could write, your column for the next day as though you saw the budget yourself. Because that is how this country, for whatever reason, whether there's leakage of information or good, that is how this country has operated. So I would hope that with regard to this, that we do not procrastinate, because the consequences, is the flight of scarce foreign exchange. The key point I wish to have established, though, is that if the objective of this legislation is tightening, all the loopholes that may exist in acts that are related to this whole question of ensuring that a certain kind of crime eludes detection, then the whole question of campaign fund financing ought to be number one in the list of acts that we should be amending in any omnibus legislation of this sort. And I say that because all the critical issues in terms of objectives, in terms of safety and security of the individual and the state, in terms of strengthening of the democracy, in terms of ensuring that we don't descend into a narco state, in terms of the effects of globalism, of international networks impacting upon us negatively, if they come together in any single base legislation, it would be in the Representation of the People's Act. In that, who are the people, and our right to know who are the people who are financing our political initiatives, our political parties, sorry. Because at the end of the day, not only may they be, and they may sometimes may be legitimate institutions, legitimate financial institutions, legitimate manufacturing institutions seeking to have a lobbying influence. And there's nothing wrong with seeking to have a lobbying influence. But the question is whether in a modern democracy, the right of the rest of the population to know is a valid right, and one that should be secured in whatever legislation we have. Because the problem with all of this is, if in any one situation, the development of your local financial institutions, your local capital accumulations, merge with, especially in terms of money laundering and the impact of money laundering, merge with your drug lords and your other, whatever illegal criminal activities that, may be dominant at a point in time. If these two things merge, if those people who are laundering their drug money or laundering the proceeds of any other criminal act, if they have thus far been successful and they create parallel institutions where they would have laundered their money into, then we are in serious trouble because we may be blocking new entrants. We may, as a result of this legislation, limit the internecine warfare between drug lords. But those who have crossed over, and on those seeking to cross over, may find that subverting the political process, subverting the electoral process, is the new way to win friends, gain influence, and secure their illicit earnings at our own peril, that is the peril of the rest of the country. So the million-dollar question is, where have we reached with regard to that? And if we are satisfied that with no provision here dealing with campaign fund financing, are we in fact continuing the culture of smuggling and grumbling and grumbling and smuggling? And there is a very thin line between legitimate financial activity. But the danger in that is the implications for the Laventil posse and the Montrose posse.
Senator Creese, you're going back into territory that you've already covered, and some of which I've already asked you to link to the bill. So once again, I just caution you on the standing order with respect to relevance, okay?
Thank you, Madam President. So at the end of the day, the question which I close on, are we satisfied that this bill really is going to take us to the place we want to go, or this merely is going to go on the books and appear to international bodies and so on, that we have satisfied the requirements that the big countries are calling for, that you have in your legislation things that show that you're not encouraging money laundering, you're not encouraging all the negatives of the day. And quite frankly, these amendments here are necessary, but they are not sufficient. I thank you.
Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam President, for recognizing me. Madam President, I rise to draw conclusion to this debate, and I wish to offer my sincere thanks and gratitude to all members that have contributed to this debate. Certainly the submissions were well received. It's incumbent, Madam President, to try to do justice to a wrap-up which has spanned 3 days of the Senate's time, to try and put the context in a meaningful yet succinct way. The bill before us is, yes, one which treats with the amendment to 5 pieces of law, and it is something which seeks to strike a balance, firstly, and on the one hand, between the sovereignty of Trinidad and Tobago versus the rest of the world, and secondly, law which is intended for the peace, order, and good governance of Trinidad and Tobago within the meaning of that phrase in the Constitution, which, as we know, is the supreme law. Several members have spoken, and if I were to put it into summary, I understand the submissions on the larger, broad-scale perspective to be, 1, are we trading our sovereignty? 2, should we treat with what international entities tell us as an overriding priority to what we know ought to be done? 3, do we treat with the systemic issues in as sufficient a fashion as is necessary, both from a technical compliance with the law basis and an efficiency measurement basis, i.e., do I have the laws traversed well enough And am I applying the laws in as efficient a fashion by way of measurable outcomes? Fourthly, honourable members have also reflected upon whether there's need for further consultation, whether we have a constitutional issue that needs to be addressed by the bill before us, having a Section 13 exception and a 3/5 preamble. And then members have gone into the granular provisions as to the specific areas of the law which I propose to traverse as a whole. Senator Ramdeen put it quite well in his submissions. Senator Ramdeen put it that really he reflected upon the government's constant statement that this is an holistic approach and a whole of government approach. Senator Ramdeen's reflection, of course, in a very polarized political setting, was that the government, according to the opposition, is bereft of plans, and that the government, according to the opposition, needs to do more. But I need to put this in the context of some of what Senator Creese put into the effect. Madam President, we as a country find ourselves wrestling with some exceptional circumstances. Firstly, it is a matter of fact that we are 96% less in our revenue from the period 2010 to 2015. We are seeing no immeasurable increase in revenue, notwithstanding the rise in oil and gas prices as they're set out in the public domain. We are seeing an economy managed by almost $13 billion in reduction year on year on expenses. We're witnessing a situation where our criminal justice system has not been attended to, notwithstanding 26 years of analysis paralysis. We're watching Trinidad and Tobago stand where we have borders with a country which is under deep pressure, and that is, of course, the Bolivian Republic of Venezuela, where we have a significant issue of legacy items of criminality, guns, and other things entering our shores, where they are left over as a result of the difficulties that Venezuela has to embrace. We're watching a situation, Madam President, where we don't as a country have gaming laws to treat with gambling, where we don't as a country have campaign finance reform legislation, certainly on the books, where we don't as a country have yet operationalized in full form our laws to treat with our insurance sector, where we don't as a country have laws which have operationalized the systems around cybercrime, as Senator Creese reflected upon cyber terrorism and other aspects, where we don't as a country find ourselves in a whole of government accounting relationship and arrangement where we've treated with things like transfer pricing, where we've treated with deeper reforms to our institutions, as Senator Ramdeen reflected, the deeper reforms that are required to the Customs and Excise Division and other entities. So those are a lot of don'ts and nots and not-haves. But Madam President, in connecting the operational side of this law, these 5 pieces of law which we are seeking to amend, Senators Obika and Hussain both made this submission. Senator Obika was quite emphatic. He said he was embarrassed to read the mutual evaluation report and said that, why are we treating only with these things before us now? Why don't we treat with all? I'd just like to remind Senator Obika that the Parliament is not constructed in one sitting to treat with every law that the mutual evaluation report traverses. And for the record, the mutual evaluation report traverses not only the 5 pieces of law which we have today, which are anchored against the FATF 40 recommendations and the 11 immediate outcomes, but they also treat with beneficial ownership, amendments to the Companies Act, amendments to the anti-terrorism legislation. They treat with amendments which are required to deal with disclosures at the Board of Inland Revenue, such as to treat with Section 4, the secrecy provision in the Board of Inland Revenue. They treat with the operational improvements towards the management of the criminal justice system, insofar as the FATF and CFATF measurables look at our outcomes. What do you have to show as a result of having these laws? And our parliamentary structure does not allow one bill to treat with all of these things. In fact, there's a rule which says they must be reasonably related to each other, and therefore we have what is before us now, a miscellaneous provisions combination of laws to be amended, because that's the only way you can do this. In connecting the operational efficiencies, I must remind that we spent the first parliamentary year ensuring that we put into place amendments to the criminal justice system. Why? Amendments to the Proceeds of Crime Act, amendments to the Financial Intelligence Unit Act, amendments to the Exchange Control Act, Customs Act, amendments to the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, all have to go through the criminal justice system. And that's why, Madam President, Senator Ramdeen was correct in saying that the government reflected upon the amendments. Will these laws work any better? Should we wait until we get the system working right first before we amend the laws? Most respectfully, we can't take that approach. Our international obligations, which were committed to by the last government in 2013, in 2014, require us to meet certain international obligations for the Financial Action Task Force and for the Global Forum under the OECD obligations. And in the governance of Trinidad and Tobago being a continuum, this government must give life to those obligations. These obligations, which we treat with legislatively today, came about as a result of agreeing for Trinidad and Tobago to be the first in line for the fourth round mutual evaluation, which saw our country assessed as at January 2015. The obligations which are tied into this bill also relate, Madam President, to amendments which the OECD G20 countries require us in the Global Forum scenario. We committed to the Global Forum scenario, and it's directly related to this bill as well, in 2011, 2013, and 2014. And these international obligations are a requirement for the country. So when honorable members speak about, are we trading sovereignty in respect of the particular provisions, most respectfully, it is rather infradig for the opposition to be suggesting today that we're trading sovereignty when they, in 2011, 2013, 2014, and 2015, committed to Trinidad and Tobago effectively doing what they now say should not happen. Most respectfully, one cannot approbate and reprobate on an issue. Simply put, you can't blow hot and cold. You have to hold the line of reasonableness. And therefore, I don't find it endearing, logically or intellectually, for members of the opposition to lecture the government today about trading sovereignty. And Senator Sobers went to town on that point. In treating with the amendments to the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act and the deletion of Section 22(2)K, the bill proposes that we remove the automatic fetter where you shall not entertain a request which is related to tax evasion, and we delete it entirely. But honorable senators, and Senator Sobers in particular, made a mockery of the process because he failed to take acknowledgement of the fact that we have safeguards in the law. And the safeguards to be found in the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act are to be found in two areas, Madam President, and I wish to put them on the record. Firstly, insofar as there is a discretion to treat with the matters, and that discretion is also tied into the obligation to have the dual criminality principle met. You cannot just take any request for mutual assistance and apply it. It must be that it is equally criminal in your own jurisdiction. If it is not known to the laws of Trinidad and Tobago in terms of a crime, you cannot give the effect that honorable senators are pretending can be given. And I say so most respectfully. Madam President, many persons, Senator Mark made a song and a dance about sovereignty as well, forgetting, as he sat in government, as he did, in the position that he held whilst his party was in government of the matters which I've just traversed. But Senator Mark asked, where were we finding precedent? He wanted to know where else was trading sovereignty such as this, and therefore I'm compelled to remind that Jamaica has, in its Mutual Assistance Criminal Matters Act 1995, a similar position as the one which we have adopted today. Barbados has similar provision. Anguilla, Curacao have similar provisions. More particularly, in the CARICOM itself, there's a Caribbean Treaty on Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters, which specifically provides for the type of approaches which we're taking here today. But I'd like to remind honorable members opposite. There is no constitutional right to have protection against tax evasion. Because the argument in trading sovereignty is that we should not cause the deletion for 22(2)K as we're doing now. But that would be to make a nonsense by accepting that there's a privilege or some form of right to evade taxes. And that clearly cannot be the case. Not in light of the fact of having signed on to FATCA with the United States of America, having signed on to the intergovernmental agreements which relate to our two jurisdictions, not in light of having signed on to the Global Forum Perspectives, not in light of having signed on to the Berlin Agreement in 2014, as Larry Hawaii, as Minister of Finance, did then on behalf of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, quite a few members of the Senate reflected upon money laundering and the issue of it being a summary offense and an indictable offense in terms of the treatment and amendments that we make here. And I wish to put it this way. That is to prescribe that the law shall be offenses tried either way. You can either go summarily, you can either go indictably. It is a fact that that is a matter for the election of the prosecution as to whether they go summarily or indictably. We are not including amendments to the Summary Courts Act, Section 100 in particular, where we're asking for the consent of the defendant in what is referred to as scheduled offenses. We're not asking for that. It is true that there is no time prescription for indictable offenses, and it is true that in treatment of summary offenses, that there is a 6 month prescription period. Senator Cummings raised the issue as to whether we should have a cap on the money laundering features. But I'd like to put it this way. When one recognizes the common sense that the United States government found in prosecuting one of its most well-known underworld criminals, and I refer to Al Capone, in treat with him for tax evasion rather than for gangsterism and murder and bootlegging, I dare say that it would be dangerous to put a cap for money laundering offenses for the summary route, because one may be quite happy, as Senator Choate referred to the issue of the big fish, or Mr. Big, to have that person caught, whether it is with $1 in terms of money laundering or $1 million in terms of money laundering. And most respectfully, the government doesn't agree with the recommendation for a cap. Furthermore, there is precedent to be found in the treatment of the offense and the prescription of the sanctions which we now give by a direct proportional statement coming from the anti-terrorism law, by a direct proportional statement coming from the securities industry's legislation, by a direct proportional statement coming from the insurance law. And I don't want to be presumptive in treating with that insofar as it is part of this Senate's order paper. But the fact is that the proportionality of this law is certainly something to be factored further when we look to the construct of proportionality within the meaning of the Northern Construction case, or as laid out in umpteen Privy Council decisions. Proportionality is to be found by what your country is currently dealing with. And if we want to know what our country is currently dealing with, let's look to what the FIU has told us they are dealing with. The FIU has told Trinidad and Tobago that in 1 year, in the reporting period 2016 to 2017, that suspicious transaction activities, suspicious transaction reports have jumped from, listen to this, $4.5 billion in the period 2011 to 2016, the aggregated amount of suspicious actions and transactions was $4.5 billion. But in 2016 to 2017, that figure for 1 year alone grew to $22.5 billion. How do we really genuinely say, reduce the offense prescription, reduce the penalty, when the proportionality in the subject matter that we're dealing with is that you're treating with, in 1 year, $22.5 billion in suspicious transactions, Madam President? Madam President, several members also reflected when we treat with the FIU, as I'm on that particular point of the FIU, which of course is traversed at Clause 4 of the bill. Many members asked where we are treating with financing of the FIU, where we're treating with resources provided to the FIU. Indeed, there was a submission, a very noble submission on the part of Senator Ramdeen for the consideration of a law enforcement type of FIU, which is one of the prescriptive models. The FIU, which was elected in this jurisdiction in 2009, 2010, is an administrative type FIU. And I can say, as a matter of fact, that the government is currently looking at the law enforcement model. I can say this openly. It is that very model that we're looking to anchor the civil asset forfeiture regime into. And therefore, we're not looking at it only from an FIU perspective, but we're looking at it from a civil asset forfeiture, explain your wealth legislation perspective, and that bill has been completed and is out for stakeholder consultation in short measure. Madam President, honorable members also asked in terms of, and I think it was Senator Obika, asked about the FIU's IT capacity, the number of persons, etc. And I wish to put onto the record that as a direct result of an increase in financing provided to the FIU, that we saw their 100% increase in their positions for organizational structure for their analysis division. We saw 5 vacant positions in their compliance division being added on. And, Madam President, we also saw a significant increase in financing. And I wish to reflect upon that increase in financing, if you'd permit me to just find that note that I made on it. But in dealing with the financing, we have certainly gone up from the $1.8 odd million in allocation to the FIU under the previous government at its highest, because 2011, 2012, 2013, there were no allocations for improvement. They went at highest, as I can recall, to $1.8 million. And I can say with certainty that the allocation under this government has been successively, for the year-on-year perspective, $5 million. And that is directly evidenced in the statistics that we have as produced by the FIU for their output of analysis for STRs and SARs, as I've reflected upon. I wish to further put onto the record that the IT divisions, because Senator Obika reflected upon it, he asked whether there was a secured environment. He considered that there was an alarming statement where he was reflecting upon the FIU's annual report for 2017 under the area that dealt with upgrading of existing information technology. And I wish to put on record that the FIU is squarely focused on its enhancement, that the FIU's security posture is significantly improved, that the FIU has, in fact, engaged in connectivity to other stakeholders in the government service, so that there's a fluidity and a connectivity of exchange of information within lawful parameters, that we have seen an annual increase in the STRs and SARs, as I've reflected upon, and that is to be found in their annual report. And I found the figure, Madam President, forgive me for the financing, 2011 under the UNC, nil. 2012, nil. 2013, nil. 2014, $1.39 million. 2015 under this government, $3 million. 2016, $5 million. And 2017, $5 million. And it obviously shows in terms of the numbers that have been produced. Madam President, quite a few of our speakers focused upon the concept of proportionality and constitutionality. Senator Mark had a significantly difficult time in putting together an argument on constitutionality. Senator Ramdeen started and then flirted away from the argument in terms of dealing with a square provision. Senator Mark stretched our imaginations in alleging a 3/5 majority requirement because he said that somehow Section 4 of the Board of Inland Revenue, of the Inland Revenue legislation, was going to be invoked, and he reminded that in FATCA we had to specifically provide for the exception to Section 4 of the Inland Revenue legislation. Madam Speaker, for the record, Madam President, for the record, this bill has nothing to do with the Board of Inland Revenue legislation. It has nothing to do with Section 4 of the secrecy provisions in that law, and therefore I am being polite when I say that my good friend Senator Mark was stretching an argument to try to reach the 3/5 majority muster. Senator Mark went a little bit further in his stretch in referring upon Justice William Brennan, and in the case of Furman and Georgia, and in dealing with the concept of what he termed essential predicate punishment, and he said that this bill was excessively severe in the prescriptions. I've dealt with that point by showing what the STRs and SARs actually look like. Senator Ramdeen reflected upon constitutionality in the context of the traversing of the Section 5 right, which is the right against self-incrimination. But Senator Ramdeen found the solution himself when he read out the specific terms of Section 5(2)(f) of the Constitution, which treat with the right against self-incrimination, because this bill specifically provides that you will not be required to disclose information such as to have to incriminate yourself. And other senators asked, in fact, Senator Ramdeen went on to say that the prescription of the constitutional reflection was otiose. It was not required because the Constitution is the supreme law under Section 2 of the Constitution. Senator Choate reflected upon it by saying that it made no sense because on the one hand you were saying disclose, and on the other hand you're saying don't incriminate yourself. But the rationale for putting it into the law is squared away with the recommendations and the observations of the Financial Action Task Force, where it said that the limited power of entry, the limited power of production of information to aid the enforcement under Section 18 of the FIU Act, and in particular Section 18F of the FIU Act, which is where you must give aid to the enforcement of the laws that treat with anti-terrorism, proceeds of crime, financial obligations, and the FIU Act itself, those four pieces of law. In Section 18F and G of the Act, we have specifically put this so that we can have the prescription settled in terms of law to make it abundantly clear that we do not intend to trip upon a Section 5 right of the Constitution, and therefore it is specifically stated. A court would therefore be assisted under the rule in Pepper and Hart by having Parliament, having the Senate specifically reflected upon these provisions. Madam President, may I ask what time I specifically end?
3 minutes past 4.
3 minutes past 4. Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, several of our speakers reflected upon the customs laws. Several of our speakers reflected upon, as Senator Obika put it, Senator Obika supposed and proposed that the amendments to the Customs Act would be draconian. He alleged that there was discord in the consultation. He alleged that the maintenance of records for 6 years was onerous. He alleged that the ability, as the bill provides, to have the controller of customs stop subsequent importation would be something which would cripple the industry. And I wish to address that general sentiment. Several other senators reflected upon it, but in slightly different ways. So I thank Senator Obika for putting it forward in the fashion that he did, and I ask that the issues raised by other senators be joined into that on this point. And the reply is as follows, Madam President. First of all, we are in this particular law proposing a harmonization of customs with the Board of Inland Revenue. Under the laws that treat with inland revenue, the period of prescription for tax matters is 6 years. In fact, in the Customs Act, there is a prescription that you maintain records in certain circumstances for 7 years. It is anomalous in our law, in the customs arena, for us to hold on to a 6-month or a 1-year prescription period for the maintenance of records. Why? Customs is the 4th largest generator of revenue in our country. Senator Ramdeen very correctly said that there was institutional corruption in many aspects of government's agencies. And that's not now, that has been for quite a while. And he put it in a very eloquent way of saying that there was institutional rot or decay that had happened. And forgive me if I paraphrase wrong. But the point is, where your 4th largest generator of revenue in your economy maintains a post-audit function which just makes no sense, because you can only treat with the goods that are coming in at the point in time, and where you do not require the maintenance of records for more than the time which currently exists, and in a time frame which is in a non-harmonious arrangement as it is with the Board of Inland Revenue laws, we're really just not making sense. The amendments that we propose in Clause 5 of the bill to the Customs Act, we say to Trinidad and Tobago, maintain your records on both sides of the coin. The Customs Division, the officers of Customs, you maintain your records. We say to the importer and owner, maintain your records, and maintain it for the same 6 years that the Board of Inland Revenue can have. But, Madam President, we are not being arbitrary in our prescription by saying that there is an additional power to the controller under Section 228 and elsewhere as we propose amendments of the Customs Act. We are not being arbitrary in saying that there can be a power to suspend the importation of subsequent items. And why? Number one, there is due process alongside that. Number two, that due process is not just any average due process. It is a right of appeal within a 6-month prescription time frame to the Tax Appeal Board. The effect of that due process provision, the effect of that proportionality, is that once you have filed your appeal, you can bring in your goods. And all that any importer needs to do, if he or she or it has an objection to the controller's action, is simply to file the appeal. In fact, that is a very measured position, and it is part of the current laws of Trinidad and Tobago. So, Madam President, with the greatest of respect, if we know we have containers entering the country without supervision, if we know that the Port Authority is being stymied by some of the trade union activity for the implementation of scanners at the Port of Spain, but where there is no trade union environment, in the Port of Point Lisas, it's up and running already. And I'll ask that of Mr. Duke outside and elsewhere. But my point is this: if you know that you are having a difficulty on the scanning and importation and regularity, not only of revenue, but the control against criminality in your country, the best thing to do is to do as we're doing in this bill, which is to allow for an aid to enforcement in a post-audit environment scenario where you can actually get benefit for the taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago, but more particularly where you can prevent corruption, where you can prevent criminality. Because it is a fact that there are importations of firearms through containers. Coming out of North America, people believe that firearms come only out of South America. That is not true. We have seen importation of firearms coming out of the United States of America as well. And therefore, our border control mechanisms is critical. And whilst we are anxious in our application of prescription and prescription for solution, we believe that the post-audit environment is critical. That's why we put the balanced approach of customs itself maintaining records so that people can't allege the document went lost if there is corruption at the customs division, and also on the owner's requirement. It's true that the customs brokers, their subsidiary legislation, their regulations provide for 3 years maintenance of records, but that's customs brokers. The real privity of arrangement is between the owner and customs, and therefore you must dive to the heart of that position, and that's why we have focused upon it in the manner that we have. It's the same reason why we propose in Clause 4 of the bill, and in treating with the FIU regulations as well, that we have harmonization with change of information. We have harmonized the disclosure of information under the FIU for notice of your registered address and other particulars to the same time frame that we use in the Companies Act. And that same time frame is being applied here, so there's regularity and improvement to the ease of doing business in this country, Madam President. Madam President, the amendments that we propose in respect of the criminal justice system, as several people have reflected upon, are not insincere. Madam President, this system, this amendment of laws, and there are more to come, this amendment of laws that we propose today is directly tied to how the laws will be implemented. What are we going to see as a result of the implementation of the laws? How many more convictions are we going to have? What is the effect going to be? Madam President, just let me remind, we saved the work of the preliminary inquiries bill. It's on the order paper. I won't go into it. But I want to indicate that we will be coming back to the Senate to propose amendments to that to cause the abolition of preliminary inquiries. Secondly, it is critically important that we appreciate that what we have implemented already is very significant. And let me paint this picture. We have implemented a disaggregation of several of the pots in the criminal justice system. We have removed motor vehicle and road traffic matters into violations and some offenses. We intend in the month of April to go live with that product. Secondly, we took away the entire management of children and family matters, and we put that into the Family and Children Division Bill. And yes, the government made history by being the first government in the history of Trinidad and Tobago to pass laws, amend consequential laws, do job security and creation of positions, cause and facilitate the employment and consideration into that enterprise, outfit buildings, do rules of court and subsidiary legislation to treat with an entire area which occupied some of the criminal justice system. That Family and Children Division also saw the implementation of the computer system for the magistracy. Because right now the magistracy is dealt with by way of a manual system. Prior to the introduction, as this government put it into effect, of the criminal proceedings laws, we had one end of it being dealt with manually, that is each case-by-case position. We had another end of it being dealt with by way of a system of acceptance of inefficiency. In putting in the Family and Children Division, we did the test piloting for the entire computer system that is being applied to the magistracy, so that the case management runs alongside the criminal proceedings rules. And in fact, Madam President, I'll say to this Honorable House that we laid last Friday in the House of Representatives the Criminal Division and Traffic Court. Let me repeat that. We laid in the Parliament, in the House of Representatives last Friday, the Criminal Division and Traffic Court. And that is because we will be implementing the same formula approach that we did for the Family and Children Division in the criminal arena. That will allow us to have cases move on time, to have them tracked, to have the sanctions considered under the criminal proceedings rules, but more particularly, it allows us to take avail of the other mechanisms which we're putting in place. We have spoken to the DPP and the Commissioner of Police, and we are nearly ready to unveil the National Prosecution Agency of Trinidad and Tobago, which will be a marriage between the DPP's office and the police prosecutors at the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. 5% of prosecutions done by the DPP, 95% of prosecutions done by the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. Senator Ramdeen reflected upon what he called the shift system for the court in San Fernando. Senator Ramdeen forgot to mention that the UNC, after spending close to $400 billion, failed to even address the court in and of itself in their tenure. It's true, because of asbestos and lack of air conditioning and the use of Lasco fans for donkey years in San Fernando, that we went into that court, took off the roof, took out the asbestos, and put in the ventilation systems to air condition it, so you don't have to use Lasco fans, as Senator Ramdeen pointed out. But, Madam President, we did that. Further, Madam President, Senator Ramdeen forgot to mention that the last government sat down on the Clooney, the St. Joseph's Convent San Fernando property, was bought by the government of Trinidad and Tobago in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. They did nothing with it, Madam President. But I'll tell you this, we will open the family court in San Fernando because we are actively working on that project. It's the same way, Madam President, that they failed to open the video court at the remand yard. 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. Nothing. That court will be opened, but we go further. We intend to open a court, a full-fledged court, not a video remand court, at maximum security. Prison. The designs have been done by the judiciary, the user brief has been done, and we will do it with the same efficiency that we did the child rehabilitation centers at what was called YTC and other places. You see, Madam President, while they try to say that there's nothing going on, we are actively achieving project by project which address the operationality and common sense. Madam President, do you know that we spend on average $80 million a year in prisoner transport from the prison to the courthouse? It is not only efficiency and justice, but it is savings to the taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago to open a full-fledged court at the MSP, Madam President. And we will do it. So, Madam President, when you look to the operationalization of our laws, when you look to encouraging the use of plea bargaining, because you finally have DNA operationalized, and I will remind, without anticipation, that we have the affirmative debate for the DNA regulations on the table of the Parliament in the House of Representatives right now. That law, the DNA law, has been law for 17 years, Madam President, and we have not once had it used in the correct context.
Attorney General, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. So, Madam President, there was a major concern of many senators present. Can we operationalize the laws? What structures are being put in place to make this thing work? Have we dealt with it in a piecemeal basis? Is it connected logically, commonsensically, and prudently to other areas of law? And the answer is that we have thought this thing through quite correctly. We cannot, Senator Hussain or Senator Obika, bring one law to fix everything. We are coming with non-profit entities, non-profit organizations, NPOs. We are dealing with gaming industry. We are dealing with campaign finance reform. Senator Creese, we as this government, under the direction of the Honorable Prime Minister, are dealing and will deal with campaign finance reform in our term. We're the only entity, political entity, in the history of Trinidad and Tobago to have said that publicly. And we will deal with it, because at the end of the day, in the tenure that we have left, and mind you, we count it in months as well, we have since day one, we are adamant that we will evidence what our work product has been, what we have produced, for people to consider whether we are deserving of a further mandate or not. In the meanwhile, we will make the hard decisions. We will implement the solutions that nobody else wants to treat with. How many times in this country's history did we talk, if I were to ask Senator Small in a previous incarnation, how many times, Madam President, did we talk about, oh, let's reduce subsidies. Let's treat with transfer pricing. Let's deal with whole of government approach. Well, revenue authority didn't come about by VUPS, VAPS, or Vikivi. Transfer pricing consideration, as Senator West is treating with it in a specific context, didn't happen just like that. Madam President, I ask this country to pay attention to the energy spotlight tomorrow. It's a whole day affair where the government of Trinidad and Tobago will put a spotlight on the energy industry, and the information which will come out from that is not only relevant to this debate, but it is materially relevant to the lives of every citizen in this country. Madam President, this is good law. This is not a panacea for every ill and evil in our society. It is well structured. We welcome the submissions of honorable senators in the committee stage, and I beg to move.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago Act, the Customs Act, and the Exchange Control Act be now read a second time. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Financial Intelligence Unit of Trinidad and Tobago Act, the Customs Act, and the Exchange Control Act.
Attorney General.
Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 66-1, I beg to move that the bill be committed to a committee of the whole Senate forthwith to be considered clause by clause.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the bill be committed to a committee of the whole Senate forthwith to be considered clause by clause. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. The Senate shall now go into committee of the whole to consider the bill clause by clause.
Yes, Madam President. Madam Chairman, yes, please.
Clause 1.
The question is that clause 1 stand part of the bill. The question is that clause 1 now stand part of the bill.
Madam.
Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Those against say no. The ayes have it. Clause 1 now stands part of the bill.
Clause 2.
The question is that clause 2 stand part of the bill. Honourable Senators, an amendment has been circulated by Senator Ramdeen in respect of clause 2. Senator Ramdeen, therefore, I will invite you to indicate the purpose of your amendment.
Thank you, Madam President. The amendments that I circulated are amendments that are submitted on behalf of the entire opposition. Really. So, Senate, I would like I will give Senator Hussain the opportunity to deal with this amendment, if that pleases with the Chair, Madam
Senator
President.
Hussain.
Thank you very much, Senator Ramdeen and Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the amendment that we're proposing to clause 2 is that it be removed in its entirety.
Attorney General.
Madam President, I thank the Honourable Senator for the circulated amendments. Regrettably, we're not in a position to agree to this for a number of reasons which we've traversed in the debate, but suffice it to say it was a specific observation in our mutual evaluation report published on June 2016 that this offended the positions of law that are opposite to our country's best ratings. Further, Madam Chair, there is the protection to be offered by the requirement for dual criminality, and in the discretionary aspects which the rest of the law does, there is also the provision for protection against arbitrariness, which is set out in section 22(2) in and of itself, where there are numerous provisions which prescribe against political interference, malicious prosecution, etc. And those are very well-established principles of law, and they're statutorily expressly provided. Madam President, in all the circumstances, I wish to assure honourable senators, not only is there a CARICOM model suggesting this, but the laws of Jamaica, the United States of America, Anguilla, Antigua, Barbados, etc. are all in equal fashion to this. And for those umpteen reasons, I regret that the government is not in a position to accept the recommendation for the deletion of clause 2.
Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the reason that we're proposing this amendment is because from the debate we learned that under 22K, basically the state of Trinidad and Tobago can now refuse any request based on the tax laws. However, we suggested that under section 22K of the Act, there are actually exceptions in order where the state can actually lend those assistance in terms of by way of intentionally incorrect statements, which would deal with matters of tax evasion. Further to that, Madam President, we don't think that if this section is removed, there would be no efficacy of it in terms of now all of these tax matters fall within the domain of the Board of Inland Revenue, which is protected under Section 4 of that Act. So therefore, I don't know how the state will comply with its international obligations in order to proceed forward with regards to the removal of this section.
Madam Chair, it's imperative that I correct the misunderstanding of my learned colleague, Senator Hussain. This bill in no way proposes any form of treatment of the inland revenue laws. Section 4, the secrecy provision, is not relevant to this debate because what is being asked of the Honourable Senate is that we remove the mandatory provision which says that you shall not treat with tax matters by way of a request from an outside territory, that the Attorney General as the competent authority shall not treat with it. That's the language. And Madam President, there can be no confusion that the process of mutual assistance is what we're treating with and not the disclosure itself. There is nothing that the central authority can do to compel the Board of Inland Revenue to do anything. They are statutorily bound by Section 4 from keeping their secrecy provisions measured. So there is no form of intervention of Section 4 of the Board of Inland Revenue legislation.
Honourable Senators, the question therefore is that clause 2 be amended as circulated. Those in favour say aye. Those against say no. No. Therefore, Honourable Senators, the question is that clause 2 now stand part of the bill. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. The ayes have it. Clause 2 now stands part of the bill.
Clause 3.
Honourable Senators, the question is that clause 3 stand part of the bill. There is Honorable Senators, an amendment circulated in respect of Clause 3. Senator Hussain.
Madam Chair, the amendment that is circulated with respect to Clause 3 seeks to delete the proposal by the legislation to make this offence a summary offence and to impose a fine pursuant to the making of the offence a summary offence. For the reasons that I advanced in relation to the debate, which principally are that we need to equip the summary courts throughout the country with the necessary resources, both resources in terms of courts, resources in terms of manpower, and resources in terms of having the courts equipped to deal with offences of this nature. I propose that we do not at this time make this offence a summary offence.
Attorney General.
Madam Chair, I thank my learned friend for the explanation offered. I do understand his caution in terms of how one can perceive the system as currently operating. I wish to put on the record that the submission for the offence being treated in the manner in which it is comes directly from the Director of Public Prosecutions. It is one which the government accepts for the merit put forward by the DPP, and it is squarely related to the election of the prosecutor in certain circumstances elsewhere. But it makes sense from a indexing of prosecution capability to have the outcome dealt with at a summary position, particularly whilst there is the existing preliminary inquiry route, which can complicate the time frame within which. For the record, I would remind that, if I believe the number, there are approximately 27 money laundering matters before the courts. Despite them having started, some of them in the year 2012, not a single one of them has gone past preliminary inquiry. And therefore, this directly relates to the efficiency of our system. And in those circumstances, we regret that we are not able to accept the submission of my learned friend opposite.
Madam Chair, in terms of Clause 3, we are very strong on the matter of Section 3A and B, that is the summary conviction to a fine of 25 billion and to imprisonment of 15 years, and also on conviction on indictment to a fine of 50 million. Madam Chair, this is cruel. It is unusual punishment, and we do not understand the justification for this imposition, given what we have been provided in Clause 3 of this bill. The Attorney General has not justified why this hefty fine of $50 million from 25 million, and then, Madam President, a lifetime of imprisonment. This is what 30 years is equivalent to, a lifetime.
I think, Senator Mark, I understand
So we need to get some kind of justification for this.
Attorney General.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank my learned friend for his submission. For the record, I will repeat in very succinct fashion the rationale for this. Firstly, the recommendation was for proportional treatment between the anti-terrorism legislation, which prescribes the same formula, and the Proceeds of Crime Act, which we do now. Secondly, the position in the laws of Trinidad and Tobago is that the description of this sanction, this fine, this treatment of $25 million in 15 years and $50 million in 30 years, that is, as we all know, a statement of the maximum sentence that one can suffer. It is within judicial discretion to come up with the formula of fine and/or imprisonment that will match the particular offense, and that is well established in the laws of Trinidad and Tobago. Thirdly, the proportionality is directly rooted in the number of and quantum of suspicious transaction activities and suspicious activity reports, which in 1 year in our country is equal to nearly the entire sum of revenue which our country earns by way of revenue year on year. In those circumstances, the view of the government for consideration of the Honourable Senate is that this is a well-proportionate law which ought to stand.
Senator Ramdeen.
Honourable Attorney General, I hear you on the explanation that you gave, that you are simply, well, not simply, but you are agreeing with the recommendation of the Director of Public Prosecution and implementing his recommendation. Can I be allowed to ask, through you, Madam Chair, to the Attorney General, is it that in those discussions, the rationale of the Director of Public Prosecution is that if we make it a summary offense, that we would have more prosecutions in the system, or we'd be able to bring forward before the courts more persons? I just wanted to ask.
Yes, that's precisely it.
Okay, I just wanted to find out clearly what the position was. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, Madam Chair.
Honourable Senator Mark.
Madam Chair, the Anti-Terrorism Act that we have been referred, that the AG referred to, did require a special constitutional majority.
For different reasons.
Yeah,
they were traversing upon certain defined rights that were clearly expressed in that legislation. In particular, the detention provisions and the removal of treatment of property under the forfeiture provisions required the involvement of a 3/5 certification, none of which feature in this bill.
Yeah, Madam Chair, we maintain that this is unprecedented, and we will not support legislation that imposes cruel and unusual punishment upon any citizen unless you bring a special majority.
Senator Ramkisoon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, my question is in relation to the formula that was used for the amounts that we are seeking to add to this bill. And you did mention the 37 charges, and when I did look at it, we're no more than 3 million in amount that someone would be charged or has committed. Now, the thing is, I could not understand the formula.
No one has been charged. People have been charged, but no one has been convicted yet.
Convicted of something more than 3 million, right? And I could not understand how the formula was put together to get this 50 million, because I too find it a bit concerning how this fine could ever be paid by someone who does not amount to this sum of money or acquiring this. So that I just wanted to know clarification on how they came across the 50 million for 30 years or 30 years.
Attorney General.
Yes, please. I thank the Honourable Senator for her submission. There are, as I understand it, quite a few matters under consideration which are well beyond the $3 million. So that one has yet to figure out where this actually leads to. But the formula was arrived, firstly, by way of reflection on the anti-terrorism prescription. Secondly, by the recommendation of the ICRG grouping and the joint review group that sat with Trinidad and Tobago on its international observation. Thirdly, by way of reflection to the proportionality with the anti-terrorism law. Fourthly, by way of the CPC's department bringing forward the matrix which we treat with. At the end of the day, the matrix formula for quantum and number of years is ultimately a matter for the Parliament. The question is the level of scorn that the Parliament pours upon something as serious as money laundering, where we understand that the root of criminality is to be found in money. And therefore, in a society such as ours, which is grappling with the issue of crime and has been for many years, the maximum sentence and maximum fine indicator for the more serious matters is stated in the law for the consideration entirely by the judiciary as to the discretionary amounts that may or may not be applied.
Okay, thank you for clearing up, because my information was from the Trinidad and Tobago Police Services website that had that amount of no more than 3 million. But in relation to the maximum, is it in the law as it exists a maximum of 50 million, other than this proceeds of crime, that all the other legislation that you have listed, is it?
Yes, the Anti-Terrorism Act. We have provisions under the Insurance Act. We have positions under the Securities Exchange rules, positions. We have extremely high offenses under the FOR. We have significantly significant positions and treatment, both on summary level and on indictable level, which are not far off from this. In fact, for the record, whilst the UNC government was in position in the period 2010 to 2015, the stated mandate was that everything was to be done by way of summary offenses with criminalization. It was found in the Insurance Act of up to $25 million and $50 million. And that was the policy objective of the last government.
So, Honourable Senators, the question is that Clause 3, Honourable Senators, the question is, therefore, that Clause 3 be amended as circulated. Those in favour say aye. Those against say no.
No.
Thanks, Senator Mark, for voting with
so,
us.
Honourable Senators, the question is that Clause 3 now stand part of the bill. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Those against say no. The ayes have it. Clause 3 now stands part of the bill. No, Senator Mark, we have now passed Clause 3. No. So we are on to Clause 4.
No.
Yes?
No, man. I have... No, madam.
Honourable.
Clause 3, that was the 25 million and the 50 million.
So, members, may I ask that we all get with the program here? We had discussions on the proposed amendment, and then the question on the amendment was moved. The vote was taken, and then we moved to the original Clause 3, which now stands part of the bill, Senator Mark. Okay? So let us go on now to Clause 4.
No, will we object to Clause 3? And we voted against Clause 3.
Honourable Senators, the question is that Clause
4.
The question is that Clause 4 stand part of the bill. Senator Ramdeen, are you going to speak on the amendment? Senator Ramdeen, an amendment has been circulated. Senator Ramdeen.
Madam Chair, can I seek your guidance? I've suggested an amendment that takes out both C and E. Do I deal with them separately, or do I deal with them conjointly?
You can deal with them together.
Together.
Yes.
Honourable Attorney General, through you, Madam Chair, the suggestion of deleting subclause C. The suggestion of deleting subclause C is suggested on the same basis for the removal of subclause 3BA, which is the summary procedure being adopted in relation to clause 4C. With respect to E, subclause E, the position with that, Honourable Attorney General, is that 2A, which is a new subsection that the legislation seeks to give the power to secure compliance, that the FIU may require any person to provide to it any document, information, or explanation on any information. It is my respectful view that that provision is one that would engage the Section 4 right under Section 4 of the Constitution. That is the first concern that I have. And just to make it clear, that would be Section 4C of the Constitution, which is a general privacy provision. But more importantly, Attorney General, through you, Madam Chair, is that what the legislation requires the person to provide to the FIU simply is not circumscribed in any way, so that it's an overarching power without any limitation that is couched in the terms of any document, information, or explanation on any information. And therefore, what you have is that the FIU virtually has an open discretion to ask for anything. It is not even circumscribed in relation to the investigation that they may be conducting at that particular time. And therefore, I am of the respectful view that even if the Honorable Attorney General would not agree that, as he has indicated in the debate, but which I ask him to reconsider, that this is not a provision that engages the privacy provision. The second part of the 2A proposal is definitely one that will be, or has the risk of being arbitrary to the extent that it is not circumscribed in any way. So that if this is to be put into effect, an FIU officer can virtually ask someone anything, and the legislation would place under the threat of criminal sanction the person with an obligation to provide that information. And I think I think the risk is too high, and two, it allows the potential for abuse to be very apparent on the face of the legislation itself. Those are my respectful submissions.
I thank Senator Ramdeen for explaining it as clearly as he has. May I ask the Honourable Senator to consider, if perhaps I should split the response. With respect to the amendment at clause 12, which would take care of your circulated submission for deletion of subclause C and A, that's the first one of them. Subclause Section 12 of the FIU Act was ambiguous. The position and the treatment of Section 12, the order for disclosure, was treated by the DPP as a summary offense. However, some of the courts wrestled at times in the clarity of the section and bearing upon the fact that there had to be a constant repetition of the fact that no, Section 12 is really meant to be treated with summarily, the recommendation of the DPP's office was that we, out of an abundance of caution, put the express language for it being a summary matter. And therefore, we are harmonizing the practice of it being treated summarily with the point. So that was the rationale for the insertion of the word summary in Section 12(4) of the parent law. With respect to the very clear submission that you've made as to the amendments at 18G of the Parent Act, you made a very important submission that the circumscription of the law was something that we should look to because otherwise it could be arbitrary. And I agree that on first read, without looking at the marked up and track change version of the law, that you could come to that conclusion. I, however, ask you to find comfort in the fact that the inserted clauses 2A to 2E fall within the text of 18G. So the parent law, 18G, the first one, subsection 1, says in order to supply secure compliance with any written law listed under 18F, the FIU may take any of the following actions. A, enter into a business place, etc. Inspect or take documents. Inspect premises. Observe the manner in which, and this one is very important, B, require any person on the premises to provide an explanation on any such information. So that's the existing law. The existing 18G, subclause 1, is that you can have somebody be required to provide an explanation on information. 18.2, which is the existing law, says where a non-regulated financial institution or listed business refuses to give consent under 1, a police officer may apply for a warrant to enter the premises referred to in 1 and seize, inspect, observe. We have now inserted 2A, which when you read it in the context of 18G 1 and 2, the first submission in answer to your, the first submission in reply to your submission is that 2A is properly dealing with it being subject to the manner in which we have inserted it. It is circumscribed, therefore, by 1, 18G1, and 18G2. And we do accept that had we not included 2E, which specifically says nothing in this section shall be construed as requiring any person to give any information which may incriminate him, even though that is a reflection of the supreme law of Trinidad and Tobago as contained in the Constitution, we've nonetheless put it in here so that the statutory management of Section 18G of the FIU makes it abundantly clear that you are not being asked to incriminate yourself. You have the right to remain silent, as the Americans put it. So in wrap-up, 2A is circumscribed by the operation of 18G1 and 18G1B in particular, 18G2, and it is also further protected from causing any difficulty by the reflections of the insertion of clause 2E, which is specifically set out in the bill that we have before us.
Chair, how is the police, which, if we look at 2C, it does not designate a police of any particular rank? We are talking about from a constable who could interrogate an individual. And you know what goes on in this country, and the Attorney General is quite aware of what.
A little more specific. Senator Ramdeen raised an issue with respect to amendments that have been circulated. You are now making an inquiry, I believe, a general inquiry about Clause 4. Am I correct?
Am I not entitled to do that?
No, you answer me with a question. I've asked you a question, you're answering me with a question. What I'm trying to say, though, Senator Mark, that in the committee now, we don't go through everything about the bill. We're dealing with specific clauses. So can you tighten up your observations if you have a question to ask about a particular clause? Okay?
Madam Chair, without interrupting, and please guide me, I am immediately prepared to answer the question that was just asked.
But yes, I understand that, but I'm just saying as we move along, we need to just be focused on specifically what we are dealing with.
May I?
Attorney General.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I thank the Honourable Senator for the question. I ask the Honourable Senator to find comfort in the fact that 2B, where a warrant may be applied for by a police officer, it is specifically in reference to subsection 2. So 2B says a warrant under subsection 2. Let's stop there. When we go to section 18G2, it says, where a non-regulated financial institution or listed business refuses to give consent, a police officer above the rank of sergeant may apply for a warrant. So you must read the law in the context of the whole.
Madam Chairman.
Senator Choate?
Yes, through you. I have two questions for the Honourable Attorney General with respect to this portion of the legislation, of the proposed legislation. Is it then that the proposal is that the word may, as it is used in 2A and 2B, is not to be interpreted as shall?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And secondly, when we go to 2D, how does that, sorry, I beg your pardon. When we go to 2C, how does that marry with your position that the mention of the constitutional protection in the very same section makes it clear that no one is being compelled to provide information and so on? Because it means that you are saying, it means that you are saying you're not compelled, but if you don't do it, you can be convicted. And to me, that is, it doesn't follow. It seems to be a bit illogical. Maybe I am misreading it, but could I seek some clarification?
I'll make my best endeavor. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Honourable Senator. So yes, may is to be read. May is to be read as may and not shall. It's true that sometimes may and shall can be read differently depending upon how a court interprets it. But in this context, we intend it to mean may. Secondly, the FIU indicated that one of the difficulties that it was experiencing was that it was often required to give a longer form of explanation as to how it could ask for information. Even though Section 18G1B says you can require any person on the premises to provide an explanation on any information, they felt that it was necessary not only to expand upon that, but to treat with something which stood a little bit alongside it. 2C provides for an offense if it is you willfully obstruct a police officer in the exercise of his powers, which we can understand, if you willfully fail to comply with a requirement properly made, if you, without reasonable excuse, fail to give any other assistance he may require for the purposes of exercising power. And therefore, it is logical when we read 2D and 2E when it comes there to ask, well, will you be committing an offense if you say, well, I exercise my right not to incriminate myself? It's for that reason of avoiding debate that we've plucked out the information separately. So we've put, if you're required to give information at 2D, a person when required to give information knowingly gives false or misleading information is liable on summary conviction. And then to be abundantly sure that this statutory provision was not going to interrupt your Section 5 right against self-incrimination, we put in 2E. So it may be a bit inelegant, but we respectfully don't believe that you may find yourself exercising your right against self-incrimination and be guilty of an offense.
Honorable Attorney General, I see that you referred to 2D. Oh, I beg your pardon, Madam Chairman. May I? I see that you referred to 2D as the subsection which creates the liability. But when you referred to 2C, we are not simply talking about willful obstruction and failure to comply and failing to assist a police officer. We are talking about the exercise of police powers under the section. So this section that we are dealing with is a section which says that the FIU may require any person to provide it to any documents, information, or explanation on any information. Okay, so let us assume for a moment that the FIU decides to require or ask the person to provide documents, information, or explanation on any information. How is that person protected in law to be advised of his or how is he advised of his constitutional protections under this section? And it seems to me to be a bit unfair to have no provision for him to be so advised and then have him committing an offense if he fails to comply, because that is clearly set out at C, 2CC.
I do understand. I propose that you consider the fact that many laws in similar formula for implementation and protection stand upon judges' rules and upon the police standing orders and other facets, where framework law will not go into the prescriptive element of saying, well, you must advise the person of his right against self-incrimination. That's a matter of standard course that I have not seen prescriptively set out in any other law. So I find aid in that facet there. Secondly, when I look to Section 5 of the Constitution, in particular dealing with the right against self-incrimination, it specifically reads, authorize a court, tribunal, commission, board, or other authority to compel a person to give evidence unless he is afforded protection against self-incrimination. So we have brought to life the unless he is afforded the protection to self-incrimination, and we've distinguished ourselves from the cases that you referred us to. I took a look at the cases that you referred us to in your submission, all of which held that the compelling to give information was not justifiable in the circumstances of the cases set out. And therefore, we have found ourselves within the comfort of saying that we are providing statutorily the prescription that you can have your right. So whilst I've not seen this right traversed expressly in laws such as this, where one sets out nothing in the section shall be construed as requiring anybody to give information to incriminate himself, whilst I accept what Senator Ramdeen had said in his debate, that that's the supreme law and therefore it may be odious or superfluous to put it in, I still felt it necessary to err on the side of caution to put this in, because a policeman in trying to prosecute a charge for a 2C offense or a 2D offense would have to have indicated where it is the right to self-incriminate was dealt with, even though it is dealt with by way of rules and other procedures in standard practice. We've put it expressly into the law.
Madam Chairman, if I may, Honorable Attorney General, I don't want to seem argumentative, but you see, this section is dealing with a situation where the persons who are being required to provide documents, information, or explanations on any information may not necessarily be suspects. Suspects are protected by the judge's rules and the police standing orders and case law. What we have here is somebody who is really neither fish nor fowl and may not ever become a suspect or an accused person, but who may now face prosecution under this section. So I am wondering whether it would not be appropriate to be a bit more robust in the protection of that person's rights by having some sort of amendment included to say that the person shall be advised, if he is required to provide all of these things, that he is not entitled to, if he does not wish to do so.
Senator Ramdeen? Let me just hear Senator Ramdeen so you can answer all together.
Honorably, just piggybacking off Senator Choate, the requirement that Senator Choate is asking for falls in line with the exact formula that the Privy Council formulated in the Whiteman and Thornhill formulations, so that in those cases the Privy Council made it very clear that under Section 52H of the Constitution, the right that you have there, which includes all procedural provisions, what Senator Choate is asking for was recognized as being encompassed within 52H. Yeah. What Senator Choate is asking for, it would be encompassed or is covered by what the Privy Council said in Whiteman, which would have been that the fact that you have expressed the right in 2E would not give you, the fact that you've expressed.
I'm paying attention.
So, sorry,
yes,
I'm sorry. The fact that you have expressed the protection in 2E would not be, let me see, would not be sufficient, to use the word, would not be sufficient, because the fact that you've expressed the protection doesn't give the person any protection unless the person knows what they are being protected against. And that's why the right to legal representation, which is found itself in Section 5 of the Constitution, the Privy Council said, that's of no use unless the person knows they have the right to legal representation. So what Senator Choate is suggesting, I think, if we just add, and there's no prejudice that's going to be suffered to anyone, it's just making the legislation stronger and providing the protection that before any inquiry is made under this section, that you inform the person. It will cover whether the person is a suspect, whether the person is someone who is just being asked questions on an inquiry stage, and it will fall in line with the learning. Save that we would end up passing legislation that we know the Privy Council has said before wouldn't give enough protection to the applicant.
And Madam Chair, it was precisely that area I wanted to intervene and indicate that even though under Section 2E, it does not really offer the individual any comfort or any protection. And what was even more edifying is the clarification that was brought to bear by Senator Choate by saying that the persons who are being, the persons rather who are being, the persons who are being asked rather to assist the police on behalf of the FIU in providing information, they are not suspects, they are ordinary John Blow. And therefore, we need to have a provision in this section that would give those ordinary people who might fall in line with these provisions, with the protection that is required.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank honourable senators for expanding upon the rationale behind these submissions, both Senators Choate and Ramdeen, and also my learned colleague, Senator Mark. Madam Chair, we're looking at a proposed introduction of language. We're proposing to locate it within 2A and not within the exceptional language to cater for the submissions made. And that is notwithstanding the fact that I don't necessarily agree with some of what's said, but the caution won't hurt. And I won't go further than saying that the fact that it's framework as opposed to prescriptive is point one. Secondly, I take on board the caution that Senator Choate has put and Senator Ramdeen has echoed that we ought to, that we have the opportunity to be a bit more prescriptive in this framework formula. If you allow me a moment, Madam Chair, but I see that you're probably about to anticipate my suggestion as to when we're taking the break.
Yes, we're still on clause 4. Senator Ramdeen still has the other part of his amendment to deal with. So I think at this stage we will take the break and we will return at
5:20.
5:20. So we are suspended until 5:20.